The streets of Moscow. Idaho had always been peaceful. Students walking to class, families going about their daily routines, the quiet hum of small-town America. But on November 13th, 2022, that tranquility would be shattered forever by an act of violence so brutal, so calculated, that it would send shockwaves across the entire nation. 4 bright young lives were about to be cut short in the most horrific way imaginable. 4 University of Idaho students, just beginning to discover who they were meant to become, would never see another sunrise. Their names were Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. And if you remember nothing else from this story, remember them. What happened in that house on King Road wasn't just a crime. It was a calculated attack that would expose the dark reality of how evil can lurk in the most unexpected places. The person responsible wasn't some random drifter or career criminal. He was a graduate student studying criminology, someone who understood exactly how investigations worked, how evidence was collected, and most chillingly, how killers tried to get away with murder. This is the complete story of that night. The timeline that led to tragedy, the investigation that followed, and the families who refused to let their children be forgotten. What you're about to hear will disturb you. It will anger you. But it will also show you the incredible strength of those left behind, and how justice, even when it seems impossible, can still prevail. The evening of November 12th started like any other Saturday night for college students. Kaylee and Madison, best friends since childhood, decided to go out together. They'd been inseparable for years, the kind of friendship that only comes along once in a lifetime. These 2 young women had grown up together, shared secrets, dreams, and now they were sharing their final semester of college. Meanwhile, Zana Kernodle and her boyfriend Ethan Chapin were spending a quiet evening together. Ethan, one of triplets who loved working on his family's tulip farm, had come over to be with Zana. They were young and in love, the kind of couple that made everyone around them believe in happiness. Neither of them could have imagined that this would be their last night together. The house at 1122 King Road was typical of college rentals. A 3-story home where 6 students lived together, sharing meals, studying for exams, and creating the memories that were supposed to last a lifetime. 2 roommates were away that weekend, leaving just the 4 friends and 2 other housemates who would, by sheer chance, survive what was coming. As the night progressed, Kaylee and Madison made their way to the Corner Club, a local bar where students often gathered. Security footage would later show them enjoying themselves, laughing and dancing without a care in the world. They had no idea that someone was already planning their deaths. Someone who had been watching, studying their routines, learning their patterns. Around 1:30 in the morning, the 2 friends decided to get some food from the Grub Truck, a popular late-night spot that served comfort food to hungry college students. They were captured on camera there too, still smiling, still living. At 1:56 a.m., they climbed into a rideshare vehicle for the short trip back to their house on King Road. Back at the house, Zana and Ethan were settling in for the night. Zana had ordered DoorDash food that arrived around 4:00 a.m., suggesting they were still awake in those final moments. The house was quiet otherwise, with their surviving roommates already asleep in their rooms on the first floor. But someone else was awake that night. Someone who had been circling the neighborhood, making multiple passes by the house. Someone who had turned off their cell phone to avoid detection. Someone who knew exactly what they were planning to do. The timeline of terror would unfold over just 25 minutes. Between 4:00 and 4:25 a.m. on November 13th, an intruder would enter that house and systematically murder 4 innocent people while they slept. The weapon was a military-style knife, designed not just to kill, but to inflict maximum damage. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was something far more sinister. The killer moved through the house with purpose, starting on the third floor where Kaylee and Madison were sleeping together in Madison's room, just like they had done since they were little girls. The attack was swift and brutal. These two best friends, who had shared everything in life, would share death as well. But the killer wasn't finished. Moving down to the second floor, they encountered Zana, who may have still been awake from her late-night food delivery. What happened next would prove that even in her final moments, Zana Kernodle was a fighter. She didn't go quietly. She fought back with everything she had, leaving behind crucial evidence that would eventually lead investigators to her killer. Ethan, trying to protect the woman he loved, also became a victim. The young man who brought joy to everyone around him, who worked with his hands on the family farm and dreamed of a future with Zana, was struck down in what should have been the safety of their home. One of the surviving roommates would later tell police that she heard what sounded like crying, then a male voice saying, "It's okay. I'm going to help you." But this wasn't help arriving. This was the killer, possibly trying to calm one of his victims, or perhaps talking to himself as he carried out his horrific plan. The same roommate would open her door and see a figure dressed in black, wearing a mask, with distinctive bushy eyebrows. This glimpse would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. The killer walked past her toward the back of the house, never knowing he had been seen. By 4:25 a.m., it was over. 4 young lives had been extinguished in their own home, in what should have been their safe space. The killer had completed his mission and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a scene so horrific that even seasoned investigators would struggle to process what they found. But he had also left behind something else, in his haste to escape, or perhaps in the struggle with Zana. The killer had dropped a knife sheath next to Madison's body. On that sheath was a microscopic amount of DNA that would eventually lead investigators directly to him. For the next 8 hours, the house remained silent. The surviving roommates, traumatized and confused by what they had heard, didn't immediately call for help. This delay would later become a source of controversy and criticism. But experts in trauma understand that people react to horror in different ways. Some fight, some flee, and some freeze completely. When 911 was finally called at 11:58 a.m., it was too late for the 4 victims. But it was the beginning of one of the most intensive manhunts in recent memory. The Moscow Police Department, the Idaho State Police, and the FBI would launch an investigation that would span multiple states and involve thousands of tips from the public. The first responders who arrived at the house that day would never forget what they saw. Blood had seeped through the walls and was visible on the exterior of the building. Inside was even worse. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a battlefield where 4 young people had fought for their lives and lost. As news of the murders spread, the University of Idaho campus fell into a state of shock and fear. Students who had never locked their doors started barricading themselves inside. Parents drove from across the country to bring their children home. The small town of Moscow, Idaho, where the biggest crime was usually a parking violation, suddenly found itself at the center of a national media frenzy. The families of the victims were still trying to process their grief when they realized they would have to wait for answers. For 47 days, there was no arrest, no suspect, no explanation for why their children had been taken from them in such a brutal way. But investigators were working around the clock, following every lead, analyzing every piece of evidence, and slowly building a case that would eventually lead them to a suspect no one saw coming. The investigation began immediately, but in those first crucial hours, detectives had more questions than answers. The scene itself told a story of violence unlike anything Moscow, Idaho had ever witnessed. The killer had moved through the house with deadly efficiency, yet had also made critical mistakes that would eventually seal his fate. Detective work in the modern age relies heavily on technology, and investigators knew their best hope lay in the digital footprints that almost everyone leaves behind. They began collecting surveillance footage from every camera in the vicinity, hoping to piece together the movements of both the victims and their killer in those final hours. The first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Local businesses had security cameras that captured fragments of the night's events. A white sedan was spotted making multiple passes by the King Road house in the early morning hours, suggesting the driver was either lost or conducting surveillance. The timing was crucial. These passes occurred just before the estimated time of the murders, but technology alone wouldn't solve this case. The human element remained critical, and that's where Dylan Mortensen, one of the surviving roommates, became the key to everything. Her account of seeing the masked intruder would provide investigators with their first real description of the killer. The detail about bushy eyebrows seemed insignificant at first, but it would prove to be the thread that unraveled the entire case. As investigators expanded their search for the white vehicle, they issued a public appeal. They were looking for a 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra, and they needed the public's help to find it. What they didn't reveal was that they already suspected this wasn't a random crime. The methodical nature of the attack, the fact that two roommates were left unharmed, and the precision with which the killer had moved through the house, all pointed to someone with knowledge of both the layout and the occupants. The DNA evidence from the knife sheath became the investigation's North Star. While the sample was microscopic, it was enough to create a genetic profile that could be compared against databases and potential suspects. The challenge was finding someone to compare it to. Without a suspect, the DNA was just scientific data waiting for context. Meanwhile, the families of the victims were conducting their own investigations. Kaylee's sister Olivia had become a detective in her own right, tracking down the rideshare driver who had brought Kaylee and Madison home that night. She was the one who discovered the crucial timeline, confirming that the two friends had arrived at the house at 1:56 a.m., giving investigators a precise window for when the murders must have occurred. The Goncalves family's determination to find answers led them to examine every aspect of their daughter's digital life. They discovered what they believed to be connections between Kaylee and Madison's social media accounts and someone they had never heard of before. These digital breadcrumbs suggested that the killer might not have been the stranger everyone assumed. As weeks passed without an arrest, the pressure on law enforcement intensified. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing federal resources and expertise to bear on what was clearly a complex case. Behavioral analysts began developing a profile of the killer, looking for patterns and motivations that might help identify him. The profile that emerged was disturbing. This was likely someone who had studied the victims, possibly for weeks or months. The killer had chosen a time when the house would be most vulnerable, when the victims would be asleep and unable to defend themselves effectively. Yet Zana Kernodle had fought back, and that resistance had likely saved the investigation. Her defensive wounds told a story of courage in the face of unimaginable terror. She had fought with everything she had, scratching and clawing at her attacker. Those wounds suggested that the killer would have marks on his body, possibly cuts or scratches that would be visible to anyone who knew what to look for. The timeline investigators constructed painted a picture of calculated evil. The killer had likely spent time studying the house, learning the routines of its occupants, identifying the best entry and exit points. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a carefully planned execution that had taken weeks or possibly months to prepare. Cell phone data became another crucial piece of the puzzle. Modern phones constantly ping cell towers, creating a digital trail of everywhere a person goes. Investigators began analyzing tower data from the area around King Road, looking for phones that had been in the vicinity during the crucial time window. What they found was a pattern of suspicious activity that would eventually lead them to their suspect. One phone had been in the area multiple times in the weeks leading up to the murders, always during late night or early morning hours. The same phone had gone dark just before the murders, suggesting the owner had either turned it off or put it in airplane mode to avoid detection. This behavior was highly suspicious and became a focal point of the investigation. The search for the white Hyundai Elantra eventually led investigators to Washington State University in Pullman, just a short drive from Moscow. There, parked outside graduate student housing, they found the vehicle they had been looking for. The license plate led them to Brian Kohberger, a doctoral student studying criminology and criminal justice. The irony was not lost on investigators. Here was someone who had spent years studying how crimes were committed and how criminals were caught. Yet he had allegedly committed one of the most heinous crimes in Idaho's history. His academic background gave him knowledge that most killers don't possess. Knowledge about forensic evidence, investigative techniques, and criminal behavior. But knowledge can be a double-edged sword. While Kohberger may have understood investigative procedures, he had also underestimated the determination of both law enforcement and the victims' families. Every advantage he thought he had would eventually be turned against him. The DNA comparison would be the final piece of the puzzle. When investigators compared Kohberger's genetic profile to the DNA found on the knife sheath, they found what they described as a statistical match. The odds of the DNA belonging to someone other than Kohberger were calculated at 537 octillion to 1, a number so large it defies comprehension. As the net closed around Kohberger, investigators began to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a killer. This was someone who had likely been planning this crime for months, studying his victims, learning their habits, and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The arrest, when it finally came, would shock those who knew Kohberger as a quiet graduate student. But for the families of Kaylee, Madison, Zana, and Ethan, it was the first step toward the justice their children deserved. The long wait for answers was finally over, but the journey toward healing had only just begun. The arrest of Brian Kohberger in Pennsylvania marked the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another equally difficult journey for the families. As they watched his mugshot flash across television screens around the world, they were confronted with the face of the person accused of destroying their lives forever. Steve and Christy Goncalves, Kaylee's parents, had spent weeks conducting their own investigation, refusing to simply wait for answers. Their determination had led them to disturbing discoveries that law enforcement couldn't comment on, due to a gag order imposed to protect the integrity of the case. But their findings painted a picture of someone who may have been watching their daughter long before that November night. The evidence against Kohberger appeared overwhelming. His white Hyundai Elantra matched the vehicle seen circling the house multiple times. His cell phone data placed him in the area on numerous occasions leading up to the murders. Most damning of all, his DNA allegedly matched the sample found on the knife sheath left at the scene. Yet questions remained. How could someone studying criminology make such fundamental mistakes? Why leave behind the sheath that would ultimately lead to his capture? And perhaps most importantly, What was his connection to these 4 students who seemed to live in a completely different world? The defense team would argue there was no connection at all, that Kohberger was simply a convenient target for investigators under pressure to solve the case. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that driving in the area wasn't a crime, and that the DNA evidence could have been contaminated or planted. But for the families, these legal arguments meant nothing compared to the reality of their loss. Jasmine Kernodle, Zana's sister, spoke of dreams where she could see her sister one more time. Brief moments of peace in an otherwise endless nightmare. Jeffrey Kernodle, their father, struggled to understand how someone could commit such acts against innocent people who had never hurt anyone. The Chapin family channeled their grief into action, creating the Ethan's Smile Foundation to honor their son's memory through scholarships and tulip sales, connecting back to the farm where Ethan had found so much joy. Stacy and Jim Chapin knew that keeping their son's spirit alive was the only way to find meaning in their devastating loss. As the legal process moved forward, the community of Moscow began the long process of healing. The house on King Road was eventually demolished, too painful a reminder of what had been lost. The university implemented new safety measures, but nothing could restore the innocence that had been shattered that November morning. The families faced another cruel reality when Kohberger waived his right to a speedy trial, meaning they would have to wait indefinitely for their day in court. Each delay meant more time living with unanswered questions, more time watching their children's killer remain silent about his motives, but they refused to be broken by the wait. Kaylee's family ensured she received her posthumous bachelor's degree, a ceremony that should have been a celebration, but instead became another reminder of dreams cut short. When Olivia Goncalves gave birth to her daughter, Theodora Maddie, named for both victims, it seemed the universe was providing a sign that love could survive even the darkest evil. The room number at the hospital, 1113, matched the date of the murders. The time of birth, 4:21 a.m., fell within the window when Kaylee and Madison were killed. These coincidences might have seemed random to others, but for a family searching for meaning in meaningless loss, they felt like messages from beyond. As this story continues to unfold in courtrooms and headlines, 4 names must never be forgotten. Kaylee Goncalves, the driven young woman who pushed everyone around her to be better. Madison Mogan, the loyal friend who shared everything with Kaylee until the very end. Zana Kernodle, the fighter who refused to go quietly and whose resistance may have been the key to solving the case. And Ethan Chapin, the loving boyfriend who tried to protect the woman he loved. They were more than victims of a senseless crime. They were daughters and sons, friends and siblings, young people with unlimited potential who deserved to see their dreams come true. Their story is one of lives cut short, but also of families who refused to let their memory fade, investigators who wouldn't give up, and a community that came together in the face of unimaginable tragedy. The legal proceedings will eventually end. The headlines will fade, but the impact of what happened on King Road that November night will echo forever in the lives of those who loved them. Justice may come in the form of a verdict, but healing will take much longer, and the question that haunts everyone involved remains unanswered. How could someone capable of such calculated evil walk among us, studying the very system designed to catch killers like himself? Perhaps that's the most terrifying truth of all. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits in graduate seminars, studies criminal behavior, and plans the perfect crime. But as this case proved, there is no perfect crime. Only imperfect criminals who underestimate the determination of those seeking justice for the innocent. The night of November 13th, 2022 will forever be remembered as one of the darkest in Idaho's history. but it will also be remembered for the strength of families who refused to be silent, investigators who never stopped searching for the truth, and 4 young lives that continue to inspire everyone who knew their story. Sports often presents us with moments that go beyond the scoreboard, moments that reveal deeper, sometimes darker, aspects. This isn't about the game-winning shot, the championship, or the fairy tale. This is about a powerful man, a video that holds more secrets than the camera can capture, and a nation's reflection on the culture behind it. It all started as a normal basketball practice at Rutgers University. Sneakers clicked on the floor, whistles blared in the gym, young players busily practicing and chasing their dreams. At the center of it all was head coach Mike Rice, strong, authoritative, and fierce. But behind the walls of the gym, something unusual happened. A video emerged. It was grainy and low quality, but its contents were unmistakable. Coach Mike Rice yelling at players, throwing basketballs at their heads and groins, grabbing their jerseys, kicking them, and shouting profanities. His behavior was no longer encouragement or love, but outright abuse, captured in disturbing detail. Then came the slurs. Homophobic insults hurled across the gym, directed at teenage athletes. At Rutgers, where such language carried a painful history, the words cut deeper than any physical harm. When the video leaked to the public, it spread rapidly, sparking outrage. Parents, students, alumni, and people everywhere were appalled. Calls for Mike Rice's firing dominated news cycles. Politicians spoke out. Even comedy shows like The Daily Show and Saturday Night Live mocked him. But beneath the satire, a serious conversation began to emerge. Was Mike Rice just a single bad coach? Or was his behavior evidence of a more systemic problem in sports culture? Up until then, Mike Rice was an obscure figure outside collegiate basketball. Overnight, he became a symbol of toxic coaching, unchecked power, and what happens when winning at all costs overshadows basic decency. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie voiced the nation's disbelief, saying that if Mike Rice had been Kobe Bryant's coach, he would have smacked the hell out of him. Soon, parents everywhere were asking a haunting question whether they would let that man coach their child. As the scandal erupted, Mike Rice vanished from the public eye, left to deal with the consequences, professionally, personally, and emotionally. He was fired, his reputation destroyed. At home, he faced his wife and children, knowing he had let them down. This story wasn't just about punishment. It became a reflection on anger, ego, toxic culture, and regret. And perhaps, in some ways, redemption. But if redemption was possible, it wouldn't come easily or quickly. Because some mistakes leave marks that time, and even apologies cannot erase. Before he became infamous as the coach who crossed the line, Mike Rice was just a kid who loved basketball. The sport was practically in his DNA. His mother had been a star college player, and his father, Mike Rice Sr., was a former coach and well-known NBA broadcaster. Mike Sr. was famously fiery, so much so that he remains the only NBA broadcaster ever ejected from a game, tossed out for arguing with a referee from the announcer's table. In the Rice household, basketball wasn't just a pastime, it was a way of life. The game shaped family dinners, fueled debates, and ignited passion. It wasn't seen as toxic. It was simply part of who they were. Mike Rice seemed destined to follow in his family's footsteps. He played college basketball and slowly climbed the coaching ladder. His journey was not an overnight success. Starting at smaller programs, he moved from assistant coaching roles to head coach positions, earning a reputation for relentless effort and intense dedication to the game. He was focused, determined, hungry. However, unchecked intensity can sometimes take a darker turn. Mike got his first taste of success at Robert Morris University, a small school in western Pennsylvania, where he transformed a struggling basketball team into a winner. Under his leadership, Robert Morris enjoyed a 3-year winning streak and earned a spot in the NCAA tournament. His energy and intensity were central to this turnaround. Practices were tough, often harder than the games. Mike believed that this pressure would build resilience, pushing his players to, and sometimes beyond, their limits. In the small school environment, with less media scrutiny and fewer critics, Mike's demanding style flourished. But success brought attention, and in 2010 he was hired as the head basketball coach at Rutgers University. Along with a 6-figure salary, Mike was given a daunting task to transform the struggling program in one of the country's premier conferences, the Big East. The pressure was immense. Rutgers had been stuck at the bottom of the Big East standings for years, and the program needed revitalization. Mike promised to provide that spark. At first, he appeared to deliver, injecting new energy and demanding more from his players. But away from the public eye, his intense methods started to raise concerns. At home, Mike's wife, Kathy, picked up on warning signs early: his language, anger, and emotional outbursts. She frequently addressed it with him, but the behavior didn't change. In Mike's mind, his methods weren't abusive. They were meant to prepare players for the harsh realities of basketball and life. He believed his intensity built toughness. To him, if his players couldn't handle his criticism, how would they handle high-pressure moments in games? He failed to realize he had already crossed a line on the court. Mike's temper became more apparent. He often yelled at referees, berated players, and even drew technical fouls. During one particularly heated game against Louisville, Mike was ejected. Alarmed by his behavior, the director asked him why. If he was such a great coach, he kept embarrassing the university. Mike saw it differently. Later, he said that he hadn't had an anger problem and that it was a myth. He explained that he had a control problem and had lost control, emphasizing that there was a difference. However, he ignored warnings from his wife, his bosses, and even his assistant coaches, all of whom had tried to curb his destructive behavior. Driven by his ambition to prove himself, Mike became increasingly tunnel-visioned, losing sight of the purpose of coaching. For a time, Mike's methods were overlooked because winning seemed to matter more than how he achieved it. Rutgers didn't fire him, choosing instead to wait and hope his behavior would improve. However, behind the scenes, someone was already taking action. Eric Murdoch, a former NBA player and assistant coach at Rutgers, had collaborated closely with Mike for many years. After Rutgers chose not to renew Eric's contract, he made a fateful decision, reviewing hours of internal practice footage, a public record since Rutgers is a state school. Eric compiled the worst examples of Mike's abusive behavior into a video and handed it over to the administration. That act set off a countdown to Mike's firing and the national scandal that would follow. Mike Rice came to Rutgers in 2010 as an unpolished but hungry coach who had transformed a small program into a winner. Unlike coaches with prestigious backgrounds or legendary mentors, Mike was scrappy and determined to prove he belonged. In a college sports culture fixated on immediate success, that hunger was enough for him to land the job. Rutgers needed change. After years of failure, the program had lost its fan base, student support, and financial backers. Mike promised to reignite passion, deliver results, and break the team out of its slump. At first, it appeared he might succeed, but his harmful methods ultimately overshadowed any progress he had made. From day one, he attacked his job with urgency. His approach was intense. He pushed players relentlessly, shouting and demanding more, never satisfied. He wasn't a quiet or constructive coach. Instead, he screamed, cursed, and berated. Miss a defensive rotation, you'd get an earful. Fail a drill, you'd run it again and again, until you collapsed. Initially, some players respected his intensity, believing he was toughening them up, preparing them for pressure and the realities of life. They would say that was just how the coach was, and that he was old school. But his old school methods quickly crossed the line, repeatedly and behind closed doors. In the practice facility, his behavior escalated. He threw basketballs at players, sometimes at their legs, sometimes at their heads. He shoved them, yanked their jerseys, and hurled slurs, using homophobic insults like faggots, fairies, and sissies. He mocked and humiliated players. This wasn't an occasional lapse. It was systematic and ongoing abuse. This wasn't leadership. This was assault disguised as coaching. And the worst part, everyone saw it. Eric Murdoch, a former NBA player and respected figure in basketball, joined Mike's staff as the director of player development. At first, he supported Mike's vision, but what he witnessed shocked him. Disturbed, Eric started documenting the abuse. As a public university, Rutgers recorded all official team practices and stored the video footage. Eric sifted through hours of archived tape, compiling a reel of damning evidence. That reel would ultimately expose everything. But within the program, a toxic culture protected Mike. Despite numerous complaints, warnings, and internal reviews, no one stopped him. The athletic department knew. The university president knew. Some staff members spoke out, but their concerns were dismissed or ignored. Why? Because firing a head coach wasn't just a disciplinary decision, it was a financial one. Mike's contract included a substantial buyout. Firing him could cost Rutgers over $1 million. So they tried to manage the issue quietly, issuing a fine, suspending him for a few games, and requiring anger management classes. They gave no public explanation, no transparency. Meanwhile, the players were trapped. Many were on scholarships. Their future opportunities depended on staying in the coach's good graces. Speaking out could mean losing playing time, support, or even their spot on the team. Some transferred to other schools. Some stayed silent. A few tried to justify what was happening. The abuse continued. Mike didn't think he was doing anything wrong. In his mind, he was molding boys into men. Breaking them down would make them stronger. He saw himself as tough but fair. Having grown up in a household where yelling was normal and passion was loud, he didn't believe he was crossing any lines, but he ignored the signals. His staff's concerns, his family's warnings, and the quiet suffering of his players. Mike's wife, Kathy, had been begging him to change for years. After games, she would point to footage on TV, showing him his rage-filled face and choice of words. She urged him to think about their children, who were starting to hear rumors. But Mike dismissed her. In his mind, his methods would be validated by results. But the results weren't coming. Rutgers wasn't improving. Mike's win-loss record remained unimpressive, and the pressure on him grew. Boosters demanded more success. The athletic department became uneasy. With every outburst, he became harder to defend. And then, things finally reached a breaking point. after Rutgers chose not to renew Eric Murdoch's contract. He handed over the practice footage he had compiled to the athletic department again. This time, he delivered a clear ultimatum if action wasn't taken. He would make sure the footage became public. For months, no action was taken. Then, on April 2nd, 2013, ESPN's Outside the Lines released the footage to the public. What followed left America stunned. The videos revealed Rutgers basketball coach Mike Rice cursing, throwing balls at players' heads, hurling slurs, and physically grabbing athletes mid-practice. These weren't isolated incidents. The footage included dozens of clips, spliced together. They painted a horrifying picture of a coach completely out of control. The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. Social media exploded. News outlets replayed the footage non-stop. Sports radio slammed Rutgers for protecting Mike. Journalists began questioning who knew about the abuse and when. Students protested. Alumni threatened to cut off donations. Parents of players expressed their outrage. Within 24 hours, Mike Rice was fired, but the damage had already been done. The scandal quickly escalated. Rutgers athletic director Tim Pernetti, who had decided not to fire Mike earlier, resigned. The university's general counsel stepped down. The president of Rutgers faced intense criticism. Everyone involved in keeping the abuse under wraps was now under investigation. This was no longer just about Mike. It exposed deeper issues within college athletics. A culture that prioritized winning over player welfare. A system where money outweighed morality. A tradition where young athletes, many still teenagers, were expected to stay silent about mistreatment. Mike disappeared from public view, becoming synonymous with disgrace. Many of his players moved on, though some carried emotional scars from their time under his volatile leadership. Some forgave him, but others refused to speak with him again. In the following months, Mike sought help. He entered anger management, met with therapists, and began volunteering with high schools and youth sports leagues. He tried to rebuild himself and his reputation, quietly and slowly, but for many, it was far too late. The footage couldn't be erased, and the memories of his behavior couldn't be unseen. The scandal revealed what Mike was really like behind closed doors, who he truly was when no one was supposed to be watching. Mike built his career on fiery intensity, but ultimately destroyed it through cruelty. The same culture that once celebrated his passion was now responsible for his fall. In early April 2013, the footage went viral. Grainy practice clips shot inside Rutgers' basketball facility were broadcast nationwide by ESPN's Outside the Lines. Within hours, the videos were everywhere, on Twitter, Facebook, news channels, and YouTube. Almost overnight, it seemed like the entire country had seen what was never meant to be public. No narration or commentary was necessary. The footage said it all. The clips showed Mike stalking the gym floor, his face red with rage and veins bulging as he screamed insults. He hurled basketballs at players with force. One incident showed a ball bouncing off a player's head, another ricocheting off a leg. The videos captured him lunging at players, grabbing them, and shouting slurs like faggots, sissies, and motherfuckers. Every word echoed like a weapon in the gym. This was far more than intensity. It was outright abuse, and the entire world saw it, from homes to dorm rooms to break rooms across the nation. People watched the footage in disbelief. Some shook their heads in disgust. Others turned away. While some replayed the video just to reassure themselves they hadn't misinterpreted what they saw. The media responded immediately. Overnight, Mike became a national disgrace. He wasn't just a bad coach. He was that coach, the one who bullied and humiliated his players on camera. ESPN analysts dissected the video. Late-night comedians mocked him, and public figures joined in to condemn him. Famous athletes like Charles Barkley, LeBron James, and Magic Johnson weighed in. Even coaches known for their strictness and discipline agreed that Mike had crossed every line imaginable. The fallout continued at Rutgers. Within a day of the footage going public, the university was in chaos. The outcry was deafening. Students protested in the streets of New Brunswick, demanding accountability. Outraged parents called into local radio stations, furious that their children had been subjected to Mike's treatment. Alumni threatened to end their financial support of the university. The scandal had spilled far beyond the gym. It wasn't just about Mike anymore. It was about the broken culture of college sports. The phones at the president's office were ringing non-stop. Reporters set up camp outside the athletic department. Board members scrambled to hold emergency meetings. At the center of the chaos was Tim Pernetti, the athletic director who had seen the footage months earlier, but chose not to fire Mike Rice. It was soon obvious that this wasn't a case of a university blindsided by new revelations. Rutgers had already known. The video had been submitted months prior, and internal meetings had taken place. Mike had been suspended for 3 games, fined $75,000, and ordered to attend anger management. But the video itself was kept under wraps. Now, that decision seemed like a deliberate cover-up. Tim Pernetti released a public statement saying that he had always tried to do what was right. But in that case, he regretted not taking stronger action sooner. His statement did little to control the damage, but by then, the damage was done. The entire Rutgers athletic program was under intense scrutiny. Critics questioned the university's leadership, its values, and the culture that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Even New Jersey Governor Chris Christie weighed in, calling the video footage appalling and stating Mike should have been fired immediately. The scandal reached beyond Rutgers, prompting colleges nationwide to re-examine their policies and oversight. If such behavior could happen and be documented at Rutgers, what might be happening behind closed doors elsewhere? Meanwhile, Eric Murdoch, the whistleblower who turned in the tape, sparked mixed reactions. Some hailed him as a hero for exposing the toxic culture, while others accused him of acting out of spite after his contract wasn't renewed. Eric dismissed the accusations, saying in interviews that he hadn't done it for revenge, but because he believed it was wrong. He stated that what Mike did to those players was not how human beings should be treated. As the media frenzy slightly subsided in the weeks that followed, the consequences of the scandal continued to unfold. Former players' parents began speaking out, revealing that their sons came home emotionally drained. Some admitted they had advised their children to stay quiet, not wanting to risk losing their scholarships. Other players, like former Rutgers guard Derek Randall, shared first-hand accounts of how Mike's abusive behavior left lasting scars. Some players defended Mike, saying he pushed them to improve and wasn't a bad person. But the footage painted a stark picture. The line had been crossed, time and time again. As for Mike, he eventually broke his silence in a televised interview, admitting that he had been wrong. He said he had no excuse, that he had lost control, let his emotions take over, and let down the people he cared about most. Mike didn't try to justify his behavior or shift blame. He acknowledged that he had failed as a leader, and he said the most painful part of it all was facing his children's disappointment. Mike described his therapy sessions as the most difficult experience of his life. Week after week, he was forced to watch the tape, not as a coach, but as a father, husband, and human being. Over time, Mike Rice started volunteering with youth basketball programs. He led clinics, mentored young players, and gave speeches about emotional control and the power of words. Some viewed these actions as genuine growth, while others saw them as an attempt to repair his reputation. Regardless of intent, the scandal cast a lasting shadow. The Rutgers basketball program struggled to recover. Recruiting efforts faltered, players transferred, morale plummeted, and the university spent years working to rebuild trust with students, families, and donors alike. The NCAA, already criticized for other issues, faced renewed scrutiny over its lack of oversight and the treatment of student athletes. Lawmakers pushed for reforms aimed at protecting athletes from abusive coaching. Some schools introduced stricter reporting systems, while others quietly re-examined their own programs, hoping to avoid a similar controversy. Yet despite these reforms, one fundamental truth remained: no policy. Training or code of conduct can stop abuse without individuals stepping up to confront it when they see it. The Rutgers case wasn't just about a coach losing his temper. It exposed a system that enabled and protected him while silencing those who tried to speak out. Mike didn't just betray his players, the institution failed them as well. That's why the video was so shocking. It wasn't just the disturbing footage. It was the years of silence, excuses, fear, money, and a toxic culture that allowed this behavior to thrive behind closed doors. In a televised interview, Mike issued a public apology, not to save his career, which was nearly destroyed, but to explain what had driven him to that point. He admitted that he had been out of control and that he had let his competitive drive override his values. He also confessed that he had coached through fear and anger, and that wasn't the kind of person he wanted to be. He didn't cry or plead for forgiveness. He didn't offer excuses. Instead, he took responsibility for his actions, acknowledging the pain he caused, especially to his players. Still, many remained skeptical. Some dismissed his remorse as calculated and insincere, a case of too little, too late. After all, how could someone who hurled slurs one year claim personal transformation the next? Former players were divided. Some privately spoke of enduring trauma, panic attacks, mistrust of authority, and memories of practices burned into their minds. Others defended Mike, arguing that he never intended harm and had helped them grow tougher and more focused. Yet even his supporters couldn't ignore the undeniable truth captured on video. This wasn't speculation. It was documented abuse. Rutgers didn't forgive him. The NCAA didn't welcome him back. No other programs reached out. His name became toxic. Parents didn't want him around their kids. Colleges avoided dealing with the questions his presence would raise. So Mike started over, not with college athletes, but with kids. He began volunteering at youth basketball camps, arriving in old sneakers and a simple t-shirt, no fancy title, no paycheck, just a whistle, a gym full of middle schoolers, and a chance to begin again with those too young to know the scandal. He taught them drills and ran warm-ups. He shared stories but also spoke about emotions, pressure, and how yelling isn't leadership. He reminded the kids that their worth wasn't tied to how many points they scored, but how they treated their teammates. Over time, some parents began to trust him with their kids. A few stayed wary, keeping their distance. But Mike wasn't asking for redemption. He just kept showing up. Back home, his wife, Kathy, stayed by his side. She had always been his voice of reason. While she didn't excuse his actions, she didn't leave him. Their family, deeply affected by the public shame, focused on healing. Their son, once teased and humiliated at school, began talking about forgiveness. Their daughter, who initially refused to watch the footage, started attending clinics again. This time, she saw her father differently, not as the man who lost control, but someone working to regain it. Still, the past lingered. In gyms or grocery stores, people sometimes recognized him. They whispered, pointed fingers, and occasionally confronted him. Some stayed silent, offering only a look that said everything. Mike didn't argue or make excuses in those moments, but acknowledged it, telling a friend that he had earned that and all he could do now was try to be better. As the years went by, the scandal faded from public attention. Headlines focused on new controversies, new scandals, and new villains. But for Mike, it never really ended. It stayed with him in therapy sessions, family dinners, and the quiet moments at kids' basketball camps between drills. He never coached college basketball again. He didn't aim for national recognition. He never even tried. Instead, he kept rebuilding, not for public opinion or media redemption, but for the people closest to him. The ones he faced every day. The ones who mattered the most. This wasn't about fixing his reputation. It was about accepting responsibility. And that is the difference between regret and true remorse. The Mike scandal didn't end with his firing. It sparked a reckoning. It forced college athletics to reevaluate the line between being a tough coach and being abusive. It revealed how some institutions prioritize image over accountability. It reminded everyone that behind every player, behind every jersey and scholarship, is a human being who deserves respect, not just discipline. Mike never returned to the college basketball stage. His name remains tied to a pivotal moment when private misconduct was dragged into public view. His story didn't fade, though. It exists in policy changes, coaching workshops, and in the tougher questions administrators now ask about what happens out of public sight. For his former players, the story leaves a personal legacy. Some carry scars, some carry lessons, but all lived through a moment that reshaped the sport and their coach. For Mike, redemption isn't a goal to achieve. It's a lifelong process of repair. The tape doesn't lie, but what a person does after the tape stops, how they take responsibility, how they change, that's the part that's harder to see. George Michael Zimmerman was born on October 5, 1983 in Manassas, Virginia. He was the third of 4 children in a family that blended different cultural backgrounds. His father, Robert Zimmerman Sr., a retired military officer and magistrate, was of German descent, while his mother, Gladys Zimmerman, was born in Peru and worked as a court interpreter. Their family is modest, but still maintains traditional values. From a young age, George was raised with a sense of discipline, community service, and civic responsibility. He was quiet, even withdrawn, in school. He struggled academically, but made up for it with a strong sense of loyalty and structure. After graduating from high school, he moved to Florida with vague, undefined dreams. He studied at Seminole State College intermittently, working small jobs, one as an insurance underwriter and another in a car dealership, before eventually settling into a role as a security officer for a gated community. He also volunteered with the Neighborhood Watch, viewing it not just as a task, but a responsibility. Friends and neighbors described him as someone who wanted to help, who sometimes took things too seriously, and who clearly admired law enforcement. George had, at points, voiced aspirations of becoming a police officer. He attended community forums, signed up for citizen police academies, and familiarized himself with Florida law. He wasn't in uniform, but he carried the demeanor of someone who believed he was serving and protecting. His past, however, included some red flags: an arrest for assaulting an undercover officer, a charge later dropped after completing a diversion program, and a restraining order filed during a dispute with an ex-fiancée. Nevertheless, George always considered himself a man of order and discipline. In 2009, he married Shelley, a licensed cosmetologist. The couple lived in a rented townhouse in the Retreat at Twin Lakes, a mixed-race gated community in Sanford, Florida. Though George lacked formal authority, he often took it upon himself to patrol his neighborhood, especially after a string of break-ins had left many residents uneasy. He obtained a concealed weapons permit and began carrying a Kel-Tec 9mm pistol. For him, safety was paramount, and something he felt personally charged to ensure. Trayvon Martin, born February 5, 1995 in Miami, Florida, was the youngest son of Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin. Although his parents were separated, they remained cooperative and respectful in raising their children, with a primary focus on their son. Trayvon split his time between his mother's home in Miami Gardens and his father's home in Sanford, often visiting extended family on school breaks and holidays. Trayvon is curious, energetic, and brings warmth and positivity to those around him. At 17, he loved playing video games, participating in sports, listening to rap music, and once expressed his dream of becoming a pilot in school. Trayvon sometimes got into trouble. He had been suspended multiple times, including once for the possession of a small amount of a banned substance. His family admitted he made mistakes, but pointed out that he was just like any other teenage boy still navigating the transition from adolescence to adulthood. While he wasn't perfect, he wasn't dangerous either. In February 2012, Trayvon was staying in Sanford with his father's fiancée, Brandy Green. His father hoped the change of pace would be good for him, a reset of sorts. Trayvon was familiar with the area, comfortable in the Retreat at Twin Lakes community. Like many boys his age, he regularly texts, listens to music, and calls his friends. One of those friends, a young woman named Rachel Jontel, would later say that Trayvon had been nervous that week, worried about a man who was watching him. George and Trayvon came from vastly different backgrounds, shaped by distinct experiences, values, and circumstances. Yet, on the night of February 26, 2012, their lives intersected in a gated community in Sanford, Florida. This chance meeting would spark a national conversation, disrupt a quiet town, and leave a lasting impact on America. What began as an ordinary Sunday in the Retreat at Twin Lakes, a neighborhood of neatly trimmed hedges and uniformed townhomes, took a tragic turn. A light rain fell over the area, and the streets were mostly quiet. Behind this calm, however, tensions were simmering within the community after a string of recent burglaries. Nervous residents whispered about unfamiliar faces, and George Zimmerman, a 28-year-old neighborhood watch captain, took it upon himself to act. George regularly patrolled the area, logging numerous calls to authorities about suspicious activity. Armed with a legally concealed 9mm handgun, he saw his role as a protector, shouldering what he believed others would not. At 7:09 p.m., George spotted a young man walking slowly in the rain and called the non-emergency police line. He reported the individual looked suspicious and up to no good. His description, a teenager in a dark hoodie and jeans. Frustration crept into his voice as he added, "These assholes, they always get away." When asked by the dispatcher if he was following the person, George confirmed he was. The dispatcher advised that they didn't need him to do that. But George had already exited his vehicle and followed the young man on foot. The man George was tracking was 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. That evening, Trayvon had walked to a nearby 7-Eleven to buy Arizona fruit juice and Skittles. On his way back, with his hoodie up to keep out the drizzle, he was on the phone with a friend, Rachel Jontel. Their conversation was lighthearted, but took a worried tone when Trayvon mentioned someone was following him. Rachel urged him to run, and he did. Then George and Trayvon come face to face, a moment filled with uncertainty. By 7:16 p.m., neighbors began calling 911, reporting a physical struggle. In the background of these frantic calls, shouts for help could be heard, followed by a gunshot. When police arrived, Trayvon was found lying face down in the grass, a fatal gunshot wound to his chest. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Nearby, George stood with minor injuries, a bloody nose and abrasions on his head. According to George, Trayvon had attacked him, punched him, and reached for his gun, fearing for his life. George said he fired in self-defense. His firearm was still in its holster when officers arrived. George was questioned but released the same night. Initially, the case garnered little attention. The police categorized the shooting as a self-defense incident, citing Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which allows individuals to use deadly force if they reasonably believe their life is in danger, with no obligation to retreat. For the Sanford police, this explanation appeared sufficient. No arrest was made. However, for Trayvon's parents, and eventually much of the nation, this outcome was unacceptable. The events of that night and their consequences sparked an intense and divisive national debate. In the aftermath of Trayvon's death, his parents, Tracy and Sabrina, demanded answers. Why hadn't there been an arrest? Why was no one held accountable for their son's death? Their voices grew louder as they appeared on news programs, held press conferences, and shared images of Trayvon, a smiling, affectionate teenager who dreamed of becoming a pilot. Public outrage began to build, and the community became deeply divided. For many, this wasn't just a local tragedy, but a national crisis. Trayvon was young, black, and unarmed. George was older, armed, and had been advised not to pursue Trayvon. To a significant portion of the public, the facts were painfully clear. Trayvon's hoodie became a powerful symbol of injustice. Protests erupted nationwide, with students walking out of schools and marches held from Harlem to Los Angeles, all chanting justice for Trayvon. The Sanford Police Department faced harsh criticism. Chris Serino, the case's original lead investigator, expressed doubts about George's account, even testifying later that George could have avoided the encounter altogether. However, other officers disagreed, leading to division within the department and the broader community over the decision not to arrest George. The release of the 911 tapes became a tipping point. The background of the calls included desperate cries for help, analyzed repeatedly by experts. Trayvon's mother, Sabrina, identified the voice as her son's. While George's family claimed it was George's, forensic experts could not reach a consensus. Still, the haunting sound of those screams gripped the nation. By mid-March, the pressure forced Sanford Police Chief Bill Lee to step aside temporarily. Florida's Governor, Rick Scott, appointed Angela Corey as a special prosecutor to independently investigate the case. Finally, on April 11, 2012, after weeks of mounting tension, George was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. During the announcement, Angela stated solemnly that they had not come to that decision lightly and that they had based it on the facts and the law. George turned himself in to the authorities and appeared in court, looking pale and expressionless. His initial request for bond was denied, but later granted at $150,000. Media swarmed the courtroom, while protesters gathered outside with signs, wearing hoodies pulled tightly. Inside, attorneys began preparing for a trial that would become about far more than just the guilt or innocence of one man. Evidence remained contradictory. George's injuries seemed to support his claim of being attacked, while Trayvon's autopsy revealed signs of a struggle. The trial will revolve around the perspectives and decisions regarding whose plea for help in the 911 call is justified. George claimed he was in fear for his life, while prosecutors argued Trayvon had every reason to feel afraid first. As the trial approached, Sanford prepared for the weighty proceedings. The trial would not only focus on George or Trayvon, but also ignite debates about justice, race, self-defense laws, and the devastating consequences of fear and suspicion. The courtroom became a reflection of the nation, exposing truths many sought to deny and others could never escape. At its heart was an undeniable tragedy. A teenager lost his life. A man faced criminal charges, and the nation anxiously awaited the outcome. On June 10, 2013, nearly 18 months after Trayvon's death, State of Florida v. George began at the Seminole County Criminal Justice Center. The courtroom filled with reporters, legal experts, and the families of both Trayvon and George, all watching silently. George, dressed in a suit and tie, sat beside his attorneys, facing a charge of second-degree murder that carried the possibility of life in prison. While his eyes remained fixed forward, the eyes of the nation were squarely on him. Was George defending himself? Or was he the one who initiated a deadly confrontation that could have been avoided? The question was complex and had no simple answer. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney Bernie de la Rionda, argued that George was mistaken in believing that a teenager walking through his neighborhood posed a threat, and then pursued, confronted, and killed him. De la Rionda told the jury that the case was not about race, but about right and wrong, emphasizing that George's actions were wrong. Prosecutors contended that George, armed with a gun, ignored a police dispatcher's suggestion to stop following Trayvon. This decision led to the confrontation that ended in Trayvon's death. To support their case, the prosecution brought forensic experts, audio specialists, and key witnesses to reconstruct the events of that night. The jury was played 911 recordings, with the screams in the background analyzed repeatedly in court. Both Trayvon's and George's families were asked to identify the voice. The prosecutor asked Sabrina, Trayvon's mother, who she recognized the voice to be, and she replied, her voice shaking, that it was Trayvon. In contrast, Gladys, George's mother, testified that the screams belonged to her son, stating that she knew it was George, as she had heard her son screaming for his life. The trial became an emotional clash of perspectives. Trayvon's friend, Rachel, who had been on the phone with him shortly before the shooting, testified about his fear and confusion. Her testimony was deeply personal but divisive. Defense attorneys questioned her credibility, while others criticized the racial and cultural biases shaping the public's perception of her. The defense, led by Mark O'Mara, portrayed George as a man attacked by Trayvon, pinned to the ground, and beaten. They presented photos of George's bloodied nose and head injuries and called witnesses to corroborate his account. John Good, a neighbor, testified that he had seen someone in a dark hoodie on top of another person during the struggle, which matched Trayvon as the aggressor. John said that the person on the bottom had been the one yelling for help, George did not testify, following his attorney's advice. Instead, the defense relied on George's recorded statements to the police, which were played for the jury. In these interviews, George described Trayvon as the aggressor and claimed he acted in self-defense. He alleged that Trayvon had followed him, punched him, and slammed his head into the sidewalk. He stated that he had been screaming for help and had thought he was going to die. The defense aimed to establish enough reasonable doubt to show that George's actions stemmed not from malice, but from fear. Under Florida's self-defense and stand-your-ground laws, that fear justified acquittal. The courtroom atmosphere was tense throughout the trial, with emotional reactions from both families, jurors, an all-female group of 6, 5 of whom were white, carefully took notes and observed testimony. In their closing arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to rely on common sense, asserting that George had made a false preconception about Trayvon. De La Rionda argued that George had considered Trayvon a suspect from the start, when in fact he had every right to be there. The defense, in contrast, focused on the physical evidence and George's feelings of fear. Mark declared that there were no monsters in this matter and insisted that the only fair verdict was to declare George innocent. After more than 16 hours of deliberation over 2 days, a verdict was reached. On July 13, 2013, just after 10:00 p.m., George was found not guilty. Silence filled the courtroom. George showed little reaction as his family quietly embraced. Trayvon's parents were not present, choosing to avoid the emotional weight of the moment. News outlets announced the verdict to the nation, their tone measured but solemn. Almost immediately, demonstrations erupted across the country, some peaceful, others filled with anger and grief, all stemming from deep pain. The jury later admitted that reaching a decision had been difficult. One juror, known only as B37, shared in an interview that they had all wanted to find George guilty of something, but the law had given them nothing to convict him of. Another anonymous juror explained that George's fear for his life in that moment aligned with the case the defense presented and the legal standards they had to apply. The law ultimately determined the outcome of this case, but for many, it didn't feel like true justice. Nonetheless, the law had the final say. George was acquitted. Legally, the matter was closed, but the story, with all its pain, division, and reckoning, was far from over. George Zimmerman was found legally innocent and set free, but his real life was not the same. The world he re-entered had fundamentally shifted, and so had he. Overnight, he became a polarizing figure celebrated by some and condemned by many. In the years following his acquittal, George remained a controversial figure, frequently making headlines, not for his freedom, but for a series of troubles. He was involved in road rage incidents, domestic disputes, and public altercations. He sued media outlets and political figures, and even auctioned off the gun used in Trayvon's death. For George, freedom did not bring peace. Trayvon Martin, however, never got another chance. He remained forever 17, preserved in the final photo shared by his parents, his face youthful and his hoodie pulled over his head. Yet, his name became far bigger than his life. It resonated in conversations, classrooms, protests, and policy debates. His death became a symbol, not only for justice but for systemic reform. Trayvon's parents, Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, transformed their grief into activism. They founded the Trayvon Martin Foundation to combat gun violence and support families impacted by it. Though their pain never subsided, they carried it with grace and turned it into purpose, demonstrating how dignity could exist in the face of profound loss. The trial's impact rippled across the United States. Trayvon's hoodie became a symbol of defiance. His tragic story sparked urgent dialogue about race, profiling, and perception. For many, his death marked a turning point, a moment when either something broke or something awakened. This loss fueled a movement, giving rise to a rallying cry, Black Lives Matter. Sanford, Florida, once an unremarkable city, became a focal point of America's ongoing struggle with race and justice. The police force underwent changes in leadership, and community initiatives intensified. Yet, the weight of those events never truly lifted. That night and its aftermath left a lasting impression not only on Sanford, but on the entire nation. Years later, the same questions lingered. What if George had stayed in his car? What if someone had stepped in earlier? What if Trayvon Martin had survived? There are no definitive answers, only pain, and the harsh reality that, in that rain, the encounter between an armed man and a black teenager forever changed the way America saw itself. May 5th, 2009. A date that would forever change a quiet suburban community and shatter the illusion of safety that so many families take for granted. What started as a routine morning would quickly transform into one of the most shocking and disturbing crime scenes that seasoned investigators had ever encountered. Picture this. You're living in what appears to be the perfect American neighborhood. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, children playing in front yards. The kind of place where people still wave to their neighbors and leave their doors unlocked. Where the biggest worry might be whether the kids remembered their homework or if dinner would be ready on time. But sometimes, evil hides behind the most ordinary facades. Sometimes, the person you trust most becomes the very person you should fear. And sometimes, the warning signs are literally written on the wall. This is the story of a family that seemed to have everything: a devoted mother, 2 young boys with bright futures ahead of them, and a father who worked in security, protecting others for a living. It's also the story of how quickly that perfect life can crumble when secrets, lies, and obsessions collide in the most devastating way possible. The morning began like countless others in Columbia, Illinois, a small community just outside St. Louis, where neighbors knew each other by name and children rode their bikes safely through quiet subdivisions. It was the kind of place where violent crime seemed impossible, where families moved to escape the dangers of city life. Christopher Coleman had left his house that morning around 5:40, heading to the gym as part of his regular routine. His wife Sherry and their 2 sons, 11-year-old Garrett and 9-year-old Gavin, were still sleeping peacefully in their beds. Or at least, that's what everyone believed at the time. By 7 in the morning, Chris was trying to reach his family by phone. When nobody answered, concern began to creep in. After all, Sherry should have been awake by then, getting the boys ready for school, going through the familiar morning rituals that define family life. What happened next would expose a web of deception so twisted and cruel that it would challenge everything this community thought they knew about the people living among them. Detective Justin Barlow lived just across the street from the Coleman family. For 5 years, he had been their neighbor, watching their children grow, exchanging pleasantries over backyard fences. When Chris called that morning, asking someone to check on his family, Barlow had no idea he was about to walk into a nightmare. The house looked normal from the outside. Nothing seemed out of place. The kind of suburban home you'd see in any middle-class neighborhood across America. But appearances, as we're about to discover, can be devastatingly deceiving. Barlow approached the front door first, peering through windows, looking for any sign of the family inside. when that revealed nothing. He made his way around to the basement area. That's when he noticed something that would prove to be crucial to understanding how this horror unfolded. A basement window was open, not just unlocked, but actually open, in a house where the family had been receiving death threats, where security should have been paramount. This detail would later raise serious questions about what really happened that night. The detective entered through the basement, making his way up the stairs toward the main floor of the house. The first thing that hit him wasn't what he saw, but what he smelled. The sharp, acrid scent of spray paint hung heavy in the air, creating an atmosphere of dread before he even understood why. As he reached the main floor and turned toward the kitchen area, Barlow encountered something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Scrawled across the walls in red spray paint were messages that seemed torn from the darkest corners of human imagination. Words like "punished" stared back at him, written in what appeared to be the hand of someone consumed by rage and hatred. These weren't random acts of vandalism. These messages had a purpose, a meaning that would become clear as the investigation unfolded. They were meant to tell a story, to point investigators in a specific direction, to create a narrative that would explain the unspeakable acts that had taken place in this suburban home. But Detective Barlow's discovery was far from over. Following the trail of disturbing messages, he made his way upstairs to the bedrooms where the family should have been sleeping safely. What he found there would shake this small community to its core and launch one of the most intensive investigations in the region's history. The scene upstairs was one of calculated brutality, masked by an attempt to stage something else entirely. 3 lives had been taken during the night, each victim found in their own bedroom, each having met their end in the place where they should have felt most secure. Sherry Coleman, 31 years old, was discovered in the master bedroom. Her 2 young sons, Garrett and Gavin, were found in their respective rooms, their lives cut short before they had barely begun to live them. The method used to end their lives was particularly disturbing, suggesting an intimate knowledge of the victims and a level of planning that went far beyond a random act of violence. But perhaps most chilling of all were the additional messages left throughout the house. More spray-painted words that seemed designed to tell a specific story about who might have committed these acts and why. Messages that would initially lead investigators down one path, only to have the evidence eventually point in a completely different direction. The phrase, "You have paid," was found leading up the staircase, as if marking a trail toward the bedrooms where the victims lay. It was a message that suggested retribution, that these deaths were somehow justified in the mind of whoever wrote those words. As word spread through the neighborhood that morning, the peaceful suburban community of Columbia was transformed into something resembling a war zone. Police cars, ambulances, and crime scene investigators descended on what had been a quiet residential street. Neighbors emerged from their homes, many still in their pajamas, trying to understand what could have happened to the family they all knew and respected. The Coleman family had seemed to embody everything that made this community special. Chris worked in security for a prominent religious organization, providing protection for high-profile events and traveling around the world in service of his faith. Sherry was a devoted mother who had put her own career aside to focus on raising their 2 boys. Garrett and Gavin were the kind of children that made adults smile when they saw them playing in the front yard. Polite, well-mannered, always ready to help a neighbor or lend a hand with yard work, they were active in local sports, did well in school, and seemed to have unlimited potential ahead of them. This was not the kind of family that anyone would expect to become victims of such brutal violence. They were pillars of their community, respected by neighbors, and seemingly living the American dream in a place where dreams were supposed to come true safely. But as investigators would soon discover, beneath the surface of this perfect family portrait lay secrets that would shock everyone who thought they knew the Colemans. Secrets about relationships, about deception, and about a plan so methodical and cruel that it would challenge everything people believed about human nature. The death threats that had been arriving at the Coleman home for months suddenly took on new significance. Were these murders the result of Chris's work in security? Had someone targeted his family as a way to get to the prominent religious figure he protected? Or was there something else entirely at play here? As investigators began piecing together the timeline of that horrific morning, questions started mounting faster than answers. The major case squad was called in immediately, bringing together 25 of the most experienced detectives from across the region. This wasn't just another crime scene. This was something that would test every skill they had developed over years of investigating the darkest aspects of human behavior. The house itself became a puzzle that investigators would spend weeks trying to solve. Every room told part of a story, but the pieces didn't quite fit together the way they should have. The basement window that had been left open raised immediate red flags. Here was a family that had been living under the shadow of death threats for months. Yet their home had been left vulnerable to exactly the kind of intrusion they should have been guarding against. Christopher Coleman was brought to the police station that morning, not as a suspect, but as a grieving husband and father who needed to help investigators understand what might have happened to his family. The image he presented was one of absolute devastation. A man whose world had just collapsed around him, who couldn't comprehend how such evil could have touched his loved ones. But experienced detectives know that grief can manifest in many different ways. Some people become hysterical, others withdraw completely. Some ask endless questions about what happened and how their loved ones died. Chris Coleman's reaction fell into none of these typical categories, and that began to concern the investigators who were trying to help him. During those first crucial hours of questioning, Coleman seemed oddly detached from the horror that had befallen his family. He never asked about the specific details of how his wife and children had died. He didn't demand to know what evidence had been found or what leads investigators were pursuing. For a man whose family had just been brutally murdered, his lack of curiosity struck the detectives as unusual. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the confines of Columbia, Illinois. If these murders were connected to Coleman's work in security, then the suspect pool could include anyone from around the world who might have harbored resentment against the religious organization he protected. Investigators began tracking down individuals who had sent threatening emails or made hostile comments about the ministry's work. It was painstaking detective work that involved following leads across multiple states and even international boundaries. Every person who had ever expressed anger or frustration had to be located and their whereabouts verified for the night of the murders. It was the kind of investigation that could take months or even years to complete thoroughly. But while that global search was underway, investigators were also looking more closely at the evidence found within the Coleman home itself. The spray-painted messages that had initially seemed to point toward an outsider with a grudge began revealing details that didn't quite match the narrative they appeared to tell. The handwriting analysis became a crucial component of the investigation. Experts were brought in to examine every letter, every stroke of the spray paint that had been used to create those menacing messages. What they discovered would eventually become one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the entire case. Meanwhile, the community of Columbia was struggling to come to terms with the reality that such violence could occur in their peaceful neighborhood. Parents began walking their children to school instead of letting them go alone. Neighbors started locking doors that had remained open for years. The sense of security that had drawn so many families to this area was shattered in a single morning. Local churches organized prayer vigils and support groups for families who were having trouble explaining to their children how something so terrible could happen to people they knew. The psychological impact rippled through the entire community, affecting not just those who knew the Colemans personally, but anyone who had ever felt safe in their own home. As the investigation progressed, detectives began uncovering aspects of Christopher Coleman's life that painted a very different picture than the one his neighbors and community members had known. Phone records, computer files, and financial documents started revealing a complex web of relationships and motivations that had nothing to do with religious extremists or international threats. The death threats that had been arriving at the Coleman home for months suddenly took on a different significance as investigators dug deeper into their origins. Computer forensics experts were brought in to trace the digital footprints of these threatening messages, and what they discovered would turn the entire investigation on its head. Every email, every letter, every threatening communication was subjected to the most advanced analysis available. The technology existed to trace these messages back to their source, to determine not just where they had come from, but what devices had been used to create them. The results of this analysis would prove to be absolutely devastating to the narrative that had initially seemed so obvious. As weeks turned into months, the investigation revealed layer after layer of deception that went far beyond anything investigators had initially imagined. This wasn't just a case of a family being targeted by strangers. This was something far more personal, far more calculated, and far more disturbing than anyone in Colombia could have anticipated. The perfect family that neighbors had admired was revealed to be struggling with issues that nobody outside their home had ever suspected. Financial pressures, relationship problems, and personal conflicts that had been carefully hidden behind a facade of suburban normalcy. The kind of problems that millions of families face, but that in this case had escalated to unthinkable consequences. Detective work of this magnitude requires not just technical expertise, but also the ability to understand human psychology and motivation. Investigators had to piece together not just what had happened on that terrible night, but why someone would be driven to commit such acts against people who should have been able to trust them completely. The evidence was mounting, but it was pointing in a direction that nobody had wanted to consider. Sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is someone you see every day, someone you trust implicitly, someone who knows your routines and your vulnerabilities better than any stranger ever could. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Tara Lynch, a woman from Florida who had claimed to be merely a friend, was actually much more than that. Phone records revealed hundreds of calls and text messages between her and Christopher Coleman. Credit card statements showed trips they had taken together. Hotel reservations painted a picture of a relationship that had been going on for months, hidden from everyone in Colombia. What made this discovery even more shocking was the connection between Tara and the Coleman family. She wasn't just some random woman that Chris had met through work. She was actually one of Sherry's old friends from high school. The ultimate betrayal was unfolding before investigators' eyes. The timeline was becoming clearer with each piece of evidence they uncovered. The affair had begun in the fall of 2008, just months before the death threats started arriving at the Coleman home. The connection between these two events was too significant to ignore. Computer forensics revealed something that would prove absolutely crucial to the case. Those threatening emails that had initially pointed investigators toward international suspects had actually originated from Christopher Coleman's own laptop. The account that had been used to send them was created using information that only someone with intimate knowledge of the Coleman family would have known. The spray paint used to write those menacing messages on the walls had been purchased at a local hardware store. and the receipt bore Christopher Coleman's signature. The same man who had reported receiving death threats had actually been the one creating them all along. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Tara Lynch had been keeping detailed records of her relationship with Coleman, including photos and videos that contradicted everything he had told investigators about the timeline of their affair. Among these photos was one that would ultimately seal Coleman's fate. A picture of the couple kissing, with a timestamp showing it had been taken weeks before Coleman claimed their relationship had even begun. When confronted with this evidence, his carefully constructed story began falling apart completely. The motive became crystal clear once investigators understood the full scope of Coleman's deception. He had been living a double life for months, promising Tara that he would divorce his wife and start a new life with her. They had even discussed wedding dates and future plans together, but there was a problem. Coleman's job with the religious ministry came with strict moral guidelines. Adultery could cost him his position and his substantial salary. He needed Sherry to be the one to file for divorce, to make it appear that the marriage had failed through no fault of his own. When Sherry discovered the affair but refused to divorce him, Coleman found himself trapped. He couldn't marry Tara without losing his job, but he couldn't continue the deception indefinitely either. The pressure was mounting from all sides, and he began planning what he believed would be the perfect solution. The death threats served multiple purposes in his scheme. They established a pattern of outside danger that would provide an obvious suspect when the murders occurred. They also gave him an excuse to install security cameras in his home, which he could later claim had malfunctioned or been tampered with. On the night of May 4th, Coleman put his plan into action. While his family slept, he methodically ended their lives, then spent time creating the crime scene that would support his story. The spray-painted messages, the open window, the missing security footage. Every detail had been calculated to point investigators away from him. The autopsy results revealed the true horror of what had happened that night. Sherry had fought for her life, sustaining injuries that indicated a violent struggle. Her 2 young sons had been killed in their beds, never having a chance to defend themselves or escape. Physical evidence on Coleman's body told the story of that final confrontation with his wife. Scratches on his arms matched the defensive wounds found on Sherry's hands. DNA evidence linked him directly to the crime scene, despite his attempts to clean up afterward. When Christopher Coleman was finally arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, the community's shock was palpable. This was a man they had trusted, respected, and admired. The revelation that he had been capable of such calculated evil shattered their faith in their own judgment about human nature. The trial that followed would captivate the nation and force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about the capacity for deception that exists within seemingly ordinary people. The evidence presented painted a picture of a man so consumed by selfishness and obsession that he was willing to destroy everything and everyone who stood in the way of his desires. In the end, justice was served. Christopher Coleman was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for the community of Columbia, for Sherry's family and friends, and for everyone who had known and loved Garrett and Gavin, no verdict could ever truly heal the wounds left behind. The writing had indeed been on the wall, but not in the way anyone had initially understood. The real message wasn't in those spray-painted threats or staged crime scene elements. It was in the pattern of lies, the web of deception, and the cold calculation that had led a father and husband to become the very monster his family should have been protected from. This case serves as a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it lives quietly among us, wearing familiar faces and maintaining respectable facades, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. The most dangerous predators are often those who know us best, who understand our vulnerabilities, and who have earned our trust through years of careful deception. The community of Colombia eventually began to heal, but they never forgot the lessons learned from this tragedy. They created memorials to honor Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, ensuring that their memory would live on long after the horror of their deaths had faded. And they remained vigilant, understanding now that safety isn't guaranteed simply by living in the right neighborhood or surrounding yourself with the right people. The writing on the wall had told a story, but it wasn't the story anyone expected to read. The small town of Corning, New York, seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. Tree-lined streets, neighbors who knew each other's names, and the kind of community where people still left their doors unlocked at night. For Michelle Neureuther, this quiet upstate haven represented everything she wanted for her 3 daughters after years of a troubled marriage. But on a late August afternoon in 2017, that sense of safety would be shattered forever. What appeared to be a tragic suicide would soon unravel into something far more sinister. A story involving manipulation, betrayal, and an unthinkable choice that would destroy a family from within. This is the story of how a father's obsession with control led to murder, and how he convinced his own daughter to help him commit the ultimate betrayal. Michelle Neureuther had always been the kind of mother who put her children first. After her divorce from Lloyd in 2013, she'd worked hard to create a stable home for her 3 girls. The oldest had already moved out. 19-year-old Carrie was away at college in Rochester, and the youngest, just 14, was still at home navigating the complexities of high school. Those who knew Michelle described her as brilliant and determined. She held a master's degree and taught English at a local college, always encouraging her daughters to be well-spoken and educated. After years of what friends described as an controlling marriage, Michelle seemed to be finding her footing as a single mother. The divorce hadn't been easy. Lloyd, an engineer at the local Corning Glass Works, had fought tooth and nail for custody of the children. What followed was a relentless legal battle that consumed years of Michelle's life and drained her emotionally and financially. Court records would later reveal an astounding 26 separate legal filings after their divorce was finalized. 26. In most cases, divorce attorneys see maybe 2 or 3 post-divorce filings at most. But Lloyd was different. He seemed determined to use the legal system as a weapon, filing motion after motion, making false claims, and trying to get out of child support payments. Michelle's friends and family watched as this legal harassment took its toll. Every time she thought she could move forward, another court date would appear, another filing, another attempt by Lloyd to drag her back into the system that had already caused her so much pain. But then, in late August 2017, something unexpected happened. Lloyd failed to show up for a crucial court hearing regarding his petition for sole custody of their youngest daughter. For a man who had been obsessively litigious for years, this was completely out of character. He didn't withdraw his petition, didn't ask for a postponement, didn't even answer the court's calls or emails. Michelle's attorney was shocked. This was the same man who had filed motion after motion for years, and now he simply didn't show up. It was unthinkable, especially given his pattern of behavior. When the case was dismissed due to his no-show, Michelle felt something she hadn't experienced in years: relief. For the first time since their bitter divorce, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, Lloyd was finally ready to move on. That weekend, Michelle seemed happier than she had been in months. Friends would later remember seeing her and her youngest daughter sliding down grassy hills on blocks of ice, laughing and enjoying the simple pleasure of a summer day together. It was the kind of carefree moment that had been rare during the years of legal battles, but that joy would be short-lived. On Monday, August 28th, a family friend arrived at Michelle's house to pick up her 14-year-old daughter for swim practice. When no one answered the door, concern quickly turned to alarm. Through the glass panels of the front door, the friend could see something was terribly wrong. Sergeant John McDivitt was the first police officer to respond to the scene that afternoon. What he found would haunt him for years to come. Michelle Neurouter was lying at the bottom of her staircase, a rope around her neck. She was cold and stiff to the touch, clearly having been dead for hours. At first glance, it appeared to be a suicide by hanging. But as McDivitt and other investigators examined the scene more closely, things didn't add up. There was an unusual ligature mark on Michelle's chin that didn't match the pattern they would expect to see in a typical hanging. It looked as though someone had gone behind her, thrown a rope over her neck, and pulled back and down. Even more concerning was the fact that Michelle's youngest daughter, the one who was supposed to be picked up for swim practice, was nowhere to be found. In a case that already seemed suspicious, a missing child raised the stakes dramatically. Police Chief Jeff Spaulding arrived on scene and immediately shared McDivitt's concerns. The physical evidence didn't match what they would expect to see in a suicide. The positioning of the body, the ligature marks, the rope itself. All of it seemed wrong somehow. As officers searched the house from top to bottom, checking basements, attics, and garages, the hours ticked by with no sign of the missing teenager. The possible outcomes were all terrifying to contemplate. Then, late that evening, the phone rang at the police station. It was Carrie, Michelle's 19-year-old daughter, calling from Rochester, nearly 100 miles away. She had devastating news to share, but also brought relief to the frantic search efforts. The 14-year-old was safe. She was with Carrie in Rochester, nearly 100 miles from the crime scene. But Carrie's explanation of how they ended up there would be the first of many stories that didn't quite make sense. She claimed that she had driven back to Corning late Saturday night to spend one last night in her childhood bedroom before the school semester began. According to Carrie, Michelle had become enraged at her, accusing her of taking Lloyd's side in their ongoing custody battle. Carrie told police that Michelle had been screaming and carrying on, and that she became concerned for her younger sister's safety. So, she claimed, she had taken the 14-year-old outside, put her in the car, and driven back to Rochester in the middle of the night. The story seemed plausible on the surface, but it raised immediate questions for investigators. Why would Michelle be so upset on the same day she had been celebrating a major legal victory? Friends and family who knew Michelle described her as determined and resilient, not someone who would take her own life just as things were finally looking up. Her mother, Jeanne, was adamant from the moment she heard the news. Michelle would never have committed suicide. She had fought too hard for too long to give up now. She had 3 daughters who needed her, a career she loved, and finally seemed to be emerging from the shadow of her toxic marriage. But if Michelle had been murdered, who could have done it? And how? Lloyd had what appeared to be an airtight alibi. According to both him and Carrie, he had been in California for a job interview when Michelle's body was discovered. He had flown out there on Sunday morning, more than 24 hours before police found Michelle on Monday afternoon. The timeline seemed to check out, but investigators weren't ready to rule anyone out just yet. They began digging deeper into the movements of everyone involved in the days leading up to Michelle's death. What they would discover would challenge everything they thought they knew about family loyalty, manipulation, and just how far a parent might go to control their children's lives. The investigation was just beginning, but already, nothing was as it seemed. When Lloyd finally returned from California and learned of Michelle's death, his first stop wasn't to comfort his grieving daughters or make funeral arrangements. Instead, he went straight to the family court building to stop his child support and maintenance payments. For investigators, this cold calculation was their first real glimpse into Lloyd's true character. But Lloyd seemed prepared for their questions. When police caught up with him outside the courthouse, he appeared calm and composed, ready with answers that matched Carrie's story perfectly. He explained how he had helped Carrie move into her college apartment on Saturday, stayed at a nearby hotel that night, and flew out to California early Sunday morning for his job interview. The hotel security cameras seemed to back up his story. There was Lloyd, checking into the microtel on Saturday evening. There was Carrie, arriving for breakfast with her younger sister the next morning at 7 a.m. The timestamps appeared to give Lloyd an ironclad alibi, but as investigators dug deeper into the surveillance footage, cracks began to appear in what had seemed like a perfect story. The cameras showed Lloyd walking Carrie to her car that Saturday night. But then something interesting happened. Instead of returning to the hotel alone, the video showed Lloyd getting into the car with Carrie and driving off into the night. More importantly, the cameras never showed him returning to the hotel that evening. While Lloyd's cell phone had remained in his hotel room all night, pinging the local towers consistently, Lloyd himself appeared to have been somewhere else entirely. The next morning, at 6:30 a.m., the cameras captured him walking across the parking lot toward his vehicle, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. For investigators, this was the first concrete evidence that Lloyd had been lying to them. But lying about where you spent the night doesn't necessarily make you a murderer. They needed more. The motive became clearer as they examined Lloyd's financial situation. Despite his engineering job at Corning, he was drowning in debt. Over $100,000 in credit card bills, and monthly payments to Michelle of nearly $6,000 in child support and alimony. The financial pressure was mounting, and Michelle's death would solve multiple problems at once. Not only would the support payments stop, but Lloyd stood to collect on Michelle's life insurance policy, worth $260,000. For a man facing financial ruin, his ex-wife's death represented a potential windfall 2.5 months after Michelle's death, with the case still officially undetermined. Investigators decided to employ a technique known in law enforcement circles as tickling the wire. They would place wiretaps on both Lloyd and Carrie's phones, then create a situation that might prompt them to have revealing conversations. The ruse was simple. An investigator called Carrie, claiming they had additional questions and wanted to meet with her again. It was a common technique, designed to create anxiety and hopefully prompt incriminating phone calls. The strategy worked better than they could have hoped. Within minutes of hanging up with police, Carrie was on the phone with her father, clearly panicked about the request for another meeting. Lloyd's response was telling. Instead of encouraging his daughter to cooperate with the investigation, he immediately began coaching her on what to say. More suspiciously, when Carrie suggested she could easily meet with the investigator and tell the same story she had already given, Lloyd shut down the idea entirely. He instructed her to claim he had a counseling appointment back in New Jersey and couldn't make himself available. For investigators listening in, Lloyd's behavior raised an obvious question. If they were both telling the truth about Michelle's death, why would Lloyd be so reluctant to speak with police again? Why coach Carrie on how to avoid the meeting? Innocent people typically want to help solve cases, not avoid investigators. But the wiretaps alone weren't enough to build a murder case. The district attorney needed more concrete evidence. so he took an unusual step. He asked a private forensic pathologist to take a fresh look at all the evidence from Michelle's autopsy. By this time, Lloyd had already had Michelle's body cremated, so there was no physical remains for the pathologist to examine. But using the original autopsy photos, documentation, and evidence from the scene, the expert reached a conclusion that changed everything. Michelle Neureuther had been murdered. The ligature mark on her chin, the specific pattern of hemorrhaging in her eyes, and other forensic details all pointed to one conclusion. Michelle had been strangled to death, and her body had been positioned to make it look like suicide. Armed with this new determination, investigators were ready to move. On January 24, 2018, nearly 5 months after Michelle's death, they coordinated simultaneous confrontations with both Lloyd and Carrie. 2 investigators showed up at Lloyd's office in New Jersey, while a pair of state police troopers found Carrie at her college internship in Syracuse. This was their Hail Mary pass, their chance to finally get the truth about what happened that night. The strategy of separating them proved crucial. When investigators told Lloyd that the medical examiner had ruled Michelle's death a homicide, he maintained his innocence. He even agreed to take a polygraph test, seeming confident in his ability to pass. But 200 miles away in Syracuse, Carrie was having a very different reaction to the news. Away from her father's influence for the first time since the murder, the psychological pressure finally became too much to bear. In barely a whisper, 19-year-old Carrie began to tell investigators what really happened on the night her mother died. Her father had come to Michelle's house with her that night, and she had helped him get inside undetected. According to Carrie's confession, Lloyd had approached her with an unthinkable proposition just 1 week before the murder. He claimed he was facing financial ruin and couldn't afford to keep paying Michelle. He presented his daughter with what he framed as an impossible choice. He could kill himself, leaving Carrie and her sisters orphaned and without financial support. Or there was what he called Plan B. He would kill Michelle instead, making it look like suicide, and the family's problems would be solved. For a 19-year-old who had been subjected to years of her father's manipulation and control, the choice seemed real. In her mind, she wasn't choosing between her parents' lives. She was choosing between losing one parent or losing both. The confession revealed the horrific details of that night. Carrie had driven back to Corning, not to spend a night in her childhood bedroom as she had originally claimed, but to help her father commit murder. She had brought him into the house through the front door, while her younger sister slept in the living room. Lloyd went upstairs to confront Michelle in her bedroom. At first, there was arguing. Michelle was confused and frightened, demanding to know why her ex-husband was in her home in the middle of the night. Then, according to Carrie, it suddenly got very quiet. When Carrie saw her father again, her mother was dead. But the confession revealed something even more disturbing. Carrie hadn't just helped Lloyd get into the house. She had helped him stage the suicide scene, moving Michelle's body and positioning the rope to make it look like she had taken her own life. The psychological manipulation that had led to this moment had been years in the making. What experts would later identify as parental alienation had systematically turned Carrie against her mother, making Michelle seem like the enemy rather than the victim. As investigators prepared to arrest Lloyd, they discovered he had vanished. The confident man who had agreed to take a polygraph test had disappeared rather than face the consequences of his actions. They tracked his cell phone to downtown Princeton, New Jersey, where they found him on the roof of a municipal parking garage. When officers moved in to arrest him, Lloyd bolted to the edge of the 5-story structure and threatened to jump. For 2 hours, he kept police at bay, teetering on the edge of the building as negotiators tried to talk him down. In the end, it took a tackle from a New Jersey state trooper to bring him safely into custody. The man who had orchestrated his ex-wife's murder and manipulated his own daughter into helping him was finally under arrest. But the most difficult questions were still ahead. How had a father convinced his child to help him kill her mother? And what price should Carrie pay for her role in such an unthinkable crime? The confession that Carrie gave to investigators that day would haunt everyone who heard it. Here was a 19-year-old college student describing in clinical detail how she had helped her father murder her mother. The psychological manipulation that had led to this moment was staggering in its scope and devastation. District Attorney Brooks Baker knew he was dealing with something unprecedented. In 30 years of prosecuting cases, he had never encountered anything quite like this. The level of control that Lloyd had exercised over his daughter, the systematic way he had turned her against her mother, represented what experts call parental alienation taken to its most extreme conclusion. Carrie's cooperation with the investigation became crucial to building the case against Lloyd. But her confession also revealed the depth of her own involvement. She hadn't just opened a door for her father. She had actively participated in staging Michelle's death to look like suicide, moving her mother's body and helping position the rope. The forensic evidence began to make sense once investigators understood what had really happened. Lloyd's DNA was found on Michelle's clothing, the pajamas she was wearing the night she was murdered. The unusual ligature mark on her chin now had an explanation. The positioning of her body at the bottom of the stairs suddenly fit the narrative of a staged crime scene. When Lloyd was finally captured after his dramatic standoff on the parking garage, prosecutors offered him a plea deal. He could admit his guilt and face 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole. Or he could go to trial and risk life without parole if convicted. Lloyd chose to plead guilty, but even in his confession, he couldn't resist blaming Michelle one final time. He told the judge he killed his ex-wife because he believed she might hurt their children. It was a final act of manipulation, an attempt to portray himself as a protective father rather than a calculating murderer. The judge saw through it immediately. Lloyd Neureuther was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At age 45, he would spend the rest of his days behind bars, never again able to manipulate or control anyone. But what about Carrie? The young woman who had been so thoroughly manipulated that she helped kill her own mother. Her case presented an almost impossible moral and legal question. How do you punish someone who was both perpetrator and victim? Michelle's mother, Jeanne, struggled with this question more than anyone. She had lost her daughter, but she also understood that Carrie had been psychologically destroyed by years of manipulation. In a letter to the court, she wrote that she didn't believe Michelle would want her daughter to spend decades in prison. The judge agreed. Carrie was allowed to plead guilty to second-degree manslaughter rather than murder. She was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in state prison, a remarkably lenient sentence that reflected the court's recognition of the extraordinary circumstances. Carrie was released on parole on January 16, 2020, after serving just over a year behind bars. She disappeared from public view, presumably trying to rebuild a life shattered by her father's manipulation and her own terrible choices. The case left everyone involved grappling with profound questions about family, manipulation, and justice. How does a parent convince their child to commit such an unthinkable act? How do you assign blame when the lines between victim and perpetrator become so blurred? Michelle Neureuther's death represents more than just another domestic violence case. It's a cautionary tale about the devastating power of psychological manipulation and the lengths to which some people will go to maintain control over others. Today, Lloyd remains in prison, his dreams of financial freedom and continued control over his family's lives reduced to the confines of a cell. His daughters must live with the knowledge that their father murdered their mother and convinced one of them to help. In the end, Michelle's fight for her children's well-being continued even after her death, as the truth of what happened that night finally came to light. The woman who had spent years trying to protect her daughters from their father's manipulation had become his final victim. But her story would serve as a warning about the deadly consequences of unchecked control and abuse. The small town of Corning, New York, where neighbors once felt safe leaving their doors unlocked, learned that the greatest dangers sometimes come from within our own families. And somewhere, a young woman tries to live with the choices she made on one terrible night, when a father's manipulation led to a mother's death and a family's destruction. When a young woman steps out for what seems like an ordinary evening with someone she trusts, the last thing anyone expects is for her to simply vanish without a trace. But sometimes the most routine moments become the beginning of something unthinkable. In October 2013, Milwaukee would witness exactly this kind of chilling disappearance, one that would grip the community and reveal disturbing secrets hiding in plain sight. This is the story of Kelly Dwyer, a vibrant 27-year-old whose sudden vanishing would expose a web of deception, dangerous behavior, and ultimately, a crime that shocked investigators to their core. What started as a missing person case would evolve into something far more sinister, involving disturbing evidence, a cadaver dog's alerts, and a man living a double life that nobody suspected. The night Kelly disappeared began like countless others. She was young, social, and exploring life in Milwaukee after moving there several years earlier. Working part-time as a nanny and at an athletic apparel store, Kelly had built a close-knit circle of friends and co-workers who knew her as someone you could count on. She was the type of person who never missed work without calling, never went offline for days, and always kept in touch with the people who mattered to her. That's why when Kelly failed to show up for her shift on October 12, 2013, alarm bells immediately started ringing. Her co-workers weren't just concerned, they were genuinely frightened. This wasn't like Kelly at all. She was attached to her phone, constantly posting on social media, always texting. But when they tried calling her, the phone went straight to voicemail. Her social media had gone completely silent. It was as if she had simply disappeared from the digital world entirely. By the time authorities became involved, Kelly had been missing for days. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Missing person flyers appeared everywhere overnight. Volunteers organized search parties. Local news picked up the story. There was something about Kelly's bright smile and infectious energy that resonated with people across Milwaukee. Parents looked at her photo and saw their own daughters. Friends recognized someone who could have been their best friend. But as investigators began piecing together Kelly's final hours, they discovered she had been living a life that was perhaps more complicated than many people realized. Kelly was active on several dating websites, meeting new people regularly. In an age of online dating and social networking, this wasn't unusual for a single woman in her 20s. What investigators found concerning, however, was how this lifestyle might have exposed her to potential dangers. The last confirmed sighting of Kelly alive came from security cameras at an upscale apartment building on Milwaukee's East Side. The footage showed her entering the building with a man she had been dating for about a year, Chris Zacco. They appeared relaxed, chatting casually as they walked through the lobby and stepped into the elevator. Kelly was gesturing with her hands in her typical animated fashion. They looked like any other couple ending a pleasant evening out. What made this footage so haunting was what it didn't show. While cameras clearly captured Kelly entering the building, there was no video of her ever leaving. In a high-security building with 28 surveillance cameras monitoring virtually every entrance and exit, Kelly Dwyer simply vanished. Chris Zacco told investigators that Kelly had left his 18th-floor apartment around 9 o'clock the following morning. He claimed he heard the front door click shut behind her as she departed. But the security footage told a different story entirely. There was no image of Kelly exiting the building through any monitored entrance. For investigators, this discrepancy immediately made Zacco a person of interest. When detectives sat down with Zacco in his apartment, they found him surprisingly forthcoming about certain aspects of his relationship with Kelly. He described their connection as friends with benefits rather than anything serious or exclusive. He readily admitted they had used cocaine together that evening and engaged in sexual activity before both passing out on his couch. His casual demeanor when discussing these intimate details struck investigators as unusual for someone whose dating partner had just disappeared. But as the interview progressed, Zacco began deflecting attention away from himself and toward Kelly's other relationships. He mentioned that she was seeing multiple people, implying that one of these other men might be responsible for whatever had happened to her. This attempt to redirect suspicion only heightened investigators' focus on him. The search of Zacco's apartment, obtained through a warrant based on his admission of drug use, revealed more than just the cocaine and marijuana investigators expected to find. They discovered something that would change the entire trajectory of the case, disturbing videos and photographs of Kelly on Zacco's phone. The images showed her in what appeared to be distressing situations, including footage where she seemed to be struggling to breathe during intimate encounters. Even more troubling were photographs that appeared to show Kelly unconscious on Zacco's bed. While investigators couldn't definitively link these images to the night of her disappearance, they painted a disturbing picture of the relationship between Kelly and Zacco. The evidence suggested behavior that went far beyond what Kelly's friends knew about their connection. Perhaps the most significant discovery came when police brought in a cadaver dog named Molly to search the apartment. The specially trained canine alerted to multiple locations throughout Zacco's residence, including his bedroom, bathroom, hallway, and the parking garage where he kept his car. These alerts indicated the possible presence of decomposing human remains, transforming what had been a missing person investigation into a potential homicide case. The bathroom search revealed additional concerning evidence. The shower curtain had been torn down, with only the bent and damaged hooks remaining. According to Zacco's long-term girlfriend, Megan, who had been in the apartment just weeks earlier, this bathroom should have contained a shower curtain, decorative towels, and a small rug. All of these items were missing. What investigators found particularly significant was that Megan, who had been dating Zacco for over 3 years, knew nothing about his relationship with Kelly. While Kelly may have believed she was in a friends with benefits situation, she was actually unknowingly involved with a man who was maintaining a serious, long-term relationship with another woman. This deception added another layer of complexity to an already troubling case. The investigation revealed that Zacco had been living what amounted to a double life. To his girlfriend Megan, he was a committed partner in a multi-year relationship. To Kelly, he presented himself as someone available for casual dating. This pattern of deception extended beyond his personal relationships and into other aspects of his life that investigators were only beginning to uncover. As police continued processing the apartment, they identified one more missing item that would become crucial to their theory of the case. Megan told investigators about a large, padded travel golf bag that had been sitting in front of the television for weeks. It was silver-colored and approximately 2 to 2.5 feet wide, large enough that people had to step over it to access the bathroom. Like the shower curtain and bathroom accessories, This bag was now nowhere to be found. The implications were chilling. Investigators began to theorize that Zocco might have used this missing golf bag to transport Kelly's body out of the apartment building. The bag would have been large enough to contain her remains and could potentially explain how he managed to remove her from the building without being captured on any of the security cameras. But this theory raised as many questions as it answered. How could Zocco have moved such a large, heavy bag through the building without being detected? The security system was extensive, monitoring elevators, hallways, and entrances throughout the complex. Yet somehow, if their theory was correct, he had managed to remove Kelly's body without leaving any video evidence of the act. The investigation was about to take an even darker turn as police prepared to examine Zocco's movements in the days following Kelly's disappearance. And what they discovered would only deepen the mystery surrounding her fate. The mystery deepened as investigators began tracking Zocco's movements through security footage and electronic records. What they discovered was a carefully choreographed series of actions that suggested someone desperately trying to conceal a crime. The timeline that emerged painted a disturbing picture of the hours and days following Kelly's disappearance. On the morning after Kelly was last seen, cameras captured Zocco leaving his apartment building at 10:08 a.m. This was significant because it coincided exactly with when Kelly's phone went completely dead. Her device had been active throughout the night, but at that precise moment, all electronic activity ceased. Investigators believed this wasn't a coincidence. Either her phone had been deliberately destroyed, powered down permanently, or thrown into water, possibly the nearby Milwaukee River, just 16 minutes later. Security cameras showed Zocco returning to the building's parking garage. But this time, he was captured standing by the trunk of his car, and investigators noticed something crucial in the footage. There appeared to be a small gray or silver object visible above the trunk level inside his vehicle. The size and shape were consistent with the missing travel golf bag that his girlfriend had described. The cadaver dog Molly had alerted not only throughout Zocco's apartment, but also on his car, specifically the trunk area, door handles, and interior. For investigators, this was compelling evidence that Kelly's remains had been transported in that vehicle. The timeline was becoming clearer, even if the full picture remained incomplete. Over the next 8 hours, security footage revealed Zocco making multiple trips to and from his apartment, systematically loading items into his car. His behavior appeared methodical, almost ritualistic, as he prepared for what investigators believed was the disposal of evidence. Finally, at 6:16 p.m., he left the building for an extended period, not returning until much later that evening. When questioned about his activities that Friday, Zocco provided what seemed like a reasonable explanation. He told investigators he had decided to take his summer sports equipment to his mother's house. According to his mother, Joyce Fry, this wasn't unusual behavior. Chris had always been athletic and often stored seasonal equipment at her home. She confirmed that he arrived around 6:30 p.m. with golf clubs and baseball equipment, and nothing about his demeanor struck her as particularly unusual. But investigators were suspicious about the timing. Why would someone choose to move sports equipment on a Friday evening? Particularly when they had plans with their girlfriend, more importantly. They wondered what had happened to that silver travel golf bag that multiple people had seen in his apartment, but which had now mysteriously disappeared the evening of Kelly's disappearance. Zocco was expected at his girlfriend Megan's house for their regular Friday night dinner. However, he didn't arrive until 8:45 p.m., more than an hour later than planned. This left a significant gap of unaccounted time between when he left his mother's house and when he appeared at Megan's apartment. During this missing hour, Investigators theorized that Zocco was searching for the perfect location to dispose of Kelly's body. Rural Wisconsin offered countless possibilities, from dense forests to remote farmland. But finding the right spot would take time and careful consideration. The fact that his cell phone was turned off during this period only heightened their suspicions. When Zocco finally arrived at Megan's apartment, she immediately noticed something was wrong. He seemed agitated, nervous, and kept fiddling with his phone, claiming it wasn't working properly. Throughout the evening, his behavior remained erratic. He was restless, unable to settle down, and seemed preoccupied with something she couldn't identify. But it was what happened during the night that Megan found most disturbing. Zocco was sweating profusely, so heavily that she actually had to change the bedsheets in the middle of the night. She had never experienced anything like this with him before, and it left her deeply concerned about his physical and mental state. For investigators, Zocco's excessive sweating made perfect sense within the context of their theory. If Kelly's body was indeed locked inside that golf bag in the trunk of his car, parked just outside Megan's apartment building, the psychological pressure would have been enormous. He couldn't leave the body in his apartment because that would be the first place anyone would look for Kelly. But he also couldn't dispose of it immediately without careful planning. The following morning brought new challenges for Zocco. If investigators' theory was correct, he still had Kelly's body in his car and needed to find a permanent solution. What happened next would provide some of the most puzzling clues in the entire case. Zocco embarked on what appeared to be an unusual shopping trip. He drove over 80 miles from Milwaukee to a small cheese shop called the Mouse House, located near Madison, Wisconsin. For a round trip of 160 miles, he purchased a single half-pound wedge of cheese, claiming it was a gift for his girlfriend's parents. To investigators, this explanation made little sense. Wisconsin was famous for its cheese, with specialty shops throughout the state. Why would someone drive such an enormous distance to purchase such a small amount of cheese from one particular shop? The route to the Mouse House took Zocco through miles of rural farmland, countless remote locations where a body could be disposed of without detection. The timing of this trip was also suspicious. Zocco had left his girlfriend's apartment early Saturday morning, presumably while she was still sleeping. He could have disposed of Kelly's body anywhere along that route and still had the cheese purchase as an alibi for his presence in the area. The receipt from the Mouse House would provide documentation that he had a legitimate reason for being so far from Milwaukee. But Zocco made a critical error on his return journey. Security cameras at a shopping center captured him entering a Sports Authority store, where he used his credit card to purchase a brand new pair of sneakers. For investigators, this purchase raised immediate red flags. Why would someone buy new shoes in the middle of what was supposed to be a simple cheese-buying expedition? Their theory was that Zocco had been forced to replace footwear that might have been contaminated with evidence while disposing of Kelly's body. Perhaps he had stepped in mud, blood, or other material that could link him to the crime. By purchasing new shoes and presumably discarding the old ones, he was attempting to eliminate potential evidence. The credit card receipt for the sneakers provided investigators with a crucial piece of the timeline puzzle. The purchase was made at 12:11 p.m., and they knew from the cheese shop receipt that he had been at the Mouse House at 9:55 a.m. The distance between these two locations was only 54 miles, a drive that should have taken approximately 47 minutes under normal circumstances. Yet there were 90 minutes unaccounted for in Zocco's timeline. 90 minutes was more than enough time to locate a secluded spot off the highway, dispose of a body, and continue on to the shopping center. For investigators, this gap represented the window during which they believed Kelly Dwyer's remains were hidden somewhere in the Wisconsin countryside. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, prosecutors faced a significant challenge. Without Kelly's body, they had no physical proof that a crime had been committed. They had suspicious behavior, lying, missing items, and cadaver dog alerts, but nothing that definitively proved Kelly was dead, let alone that Zocco had killed her. The investigation continued for months, with detectives following up on hundreds of tips and conducting extensive searches of the rural areas along Zocco's suspected route. But the vast expanse of Wisconsin farmland and forest seemed to have swallowed Kelly Dwyer without a trace. Meanwhile, Zocco faced legal consequences for the evidence that had been discovered during the search of his apartment. In November 2014, he went on trial for possession of child pornography found on his electronic devices. Despite his claims that the material had been unknowingly stored on a hard drive from his former workplace in Boston, a jury convicted him on most of the charges. A month later, Zocco pleaded guilty to the drug charges stemming from the cocaine and marijuana found in his apartment. Combined with the child pornography conviction, he was sentenced to 19 years in prison. While this provided some measure of justice, Kelly's family and friends knew that the most serious crime, her suspected murder, remained unprosecuted. The search for Kelly Dwyer seemed hopeless. Months turned into over a year, and despite exhaustive efforts by law enforcement and countless volunteers, there was no trace of the missing woman. The case appeared destined to join the ranks of unsolved disappearances that haunt families forever. But sometimes, when all hope seems lost, fate intervenes in the most unexpected ways. In May 2015, a local man was taking a walk through a wooded area about 45 miles west of Milwaukee. The location was rural and secluded, the kind of place where someone could easily dispose of something without being discovered. As he made his way through the dense undergrowth, something caught his eye. A glint of light was reflecting off something whitish in color among the trees and brush. When he moved closer to investigate, the man made a horrifying discovery. What he had seen was a human skull, partially buried under debris and foliage. He immediately contacted authorities, and within days, dental records confirmed what investigators had suspected for over a year and a half. The remains belonged to Kelly Dwyer. The location where Kelly's body was found was eerily close to the route investigators believed Zocco had taken during his mysterious cheese-buying expedition. The site was just 6 miles from the busy Interstate 94, yet completely hidden from view. It was exactly the type of remote location where someone familiar with the area might choose to dispose of evidence. However, after so much time in the elements, Kelly's skeletal remains could tell investigators very little about how she had died. There were no obvious signs of trauma on the bones, no physical evidence that could definitively establish cause of death. The scene itself yielded no additional clues, no shower curtain fragments, no clothing, no travel golf bag, but there was one detail that investigators found significant. The position of Kelly's skeleton suggested her body had been compressed into a confined space. Her legs were contorted, with one completely twisted, and her left arm was positioned behind her back in an unnatural way. To investigators, this positioning was consistent with someone who had been placed inside a large container, exactly like the missing travel golf bag from Zocco's apartment. With Kelly's body finally recovered, prosecutors felt they had enough evidence to bring charges against Chris Zocco. In 2017, nearly 4 years after Kelly's disappearance, he was indicted for first-degree reckless homicide, hiding a corpse, and strangulation. The state's theory was that Zocco had killed Kelly during a sexual encounter that went tragically wrong. When the case finally went to trial in 2018, the prosecution painted a picture of a man who engaged in increasingly dangerous sexual behavior. They presented evidence of Zocco's pattern of risky conduct with multiple women. behavior that investigators believed had ultimately cost Kelly her life. The defense argued that the evidence was purely circumstantial. They pointed out that there were no eyewitnesses, no DNA evidence, and no definitive proof of how Kelly had died. They suggested that Kelly could have left Zacco's apartment through an exit not covered by security cameras and met her fate elsewhere, possibly at the hands of one of the other men she had been dating through online platforms. But the jury wasn't convinced by the defense arguments. After deliberating for just 3.5 hours, they returned a guilty verdict on all charges. Chris Zacco was sentenced to 31 years in prison, to be served on top of the 19 years he was already serving for the drug and child pornography convictions. The conviction brought some measure of closure to Kelly's family and friends, but it couldn't undo the tragedy of her loss. Kelly Dwyer had been a young woman just beginning to discover herself and her place in the world. She was known for her infectious energy, her caring nature, and her willingness to see the best in people around her. The case serves as a sobering reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind seemingly normal relationships. Kelly thought she was involved in a casual dating situation with someone who cared about her. Instead, she had unknowingly become entangled with a man living a double life, someone whose dangerous behaviors would ultimately cost her everything. Today, Chris Zacco remains in prison, where he will likely spend the rest of his life. Kelly's story has become part of the broader conversation about dating safety, particularly in the age of online platforms where people can easily misrepresent themselves and their intentions. For those who knew and loved Kelly Dwyer, her memory lives on not in the tragic circumstances of her death, but in the vibrant, caring person she was in life. She was someone who brought light into the world, whose loss created a profound void that can never truly be filled. Her story stands as both a tragedy and a warning, a reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers come from those we trust the most. The quiet streets of Quincy, Illinois had never seen anything quite like this before. A brutal execution in broad daylight. A mother of 3 gunned down in her own bathroom. And at the center of it all, a game show answer that would echo through a murder trial. This is a story about secrets hidden behind suburban facades, about a marriage that crumbled into something deadly, and about how a single moment on national television can take on an entirely different meaning when viewed through the lens of tragedy. On a cold February morning in 2023, the unthinkable happened in this Mississippi river town, where everyone knows everyone. Becky Bliefnick, a beloved nurse and devoted mother, was found dead in the most horrific circumstances imaginable. She had been shot 14 times. 14 times. Each bullet a deliberate act of violence that would shatter not just her family, but an entire community's sense of safety. The crime scene told a story of pure terror. Someone had scaled the outside of her house in the dead of night, pried open a second-story window, and hunted her down like prey. When Becky tried to call for help, her phone was knocked from her hands. She fled to her bathroom, but there was nowhere left to run. The killer stood over her and fired shot after shot until she was gone. But this wasn't a random break-in gone wrong. This wasn't some stranger looking for valuables to steal. This was personal. This was execution. And investigators would soon discover that the answer to who killed Becky Bliefnick might have been hiding in plain sight all along. 4 years before Becky's murder, her husband Tim stood on a brightly lit game show stage, facing host Steve Harvey and a studio full of cheering fans. The question seemed innocent enough. What's the biggest mistake you made at your wedding without missing a beat? Tim looked directly into the camera and delivered an answer that would later send chills down the spines of everyone who heard it. Honey, I love you. But I said I do. The studio audience erupted in laughter. Steve Harvey doubled over. Even Tim's own family members standing beside him broke into grins. It was just a game show moment, a throwaway line meant to get a laugh and maybe win some points. But when those words resurfaced after Becky's brutal murder, they took on a meaning that nobody could have imagined, because by then, Tim Bleefnick was sitting in a jail cell, charged with his wife's murder. The story of Tim and Becky began like so many others. They met as college students at Quincy University, two young people with their whole lives ahead of them. For years, they seemed to have it all figured out. Tim built a successful career in the recycling industry, while Becky devoted herself to raising their three young sons. From the outside, they looked like the perfect American family. But perfection, as we all know, is often just an illusion. Behind closed doors, cracks were beginning to show. Friends and family members would later describe a relationship where control became more important than love, where manipulation replaced partnership. Becky, who had once been content as a stay-at-home mother, began to dream of something more. She wanted to go back to school, to become a nurse, to build a career of her own. Tim wasn't supportive of those dreams. In fact, he seemed threatened by them. When Becky finally did pursue her nursing degree, the tension in their marriage reached a breaking point. She was flourishing in her new role, helping patients and saving lives. But at home, things were falling apart. The woman who had once deferred to her husband's wishes was finding her voice, and Tim didn't like what he was hearing. In January 2021, Tim filed for divorce. But if he thought that would give him back the control he craved, he was wrong. What followed was nearly 2 years of bitter legal battles over money, property, and most importantly, custody of their 3 children. The divorce proceedings revealed just how toxic their relationship had become. Court documents painted a picture of escalating conflict, with both sides hurling accusations. Tim sought a restraining order against Becky, claiming she was harassing him. Becky fired back with her own concerns about Tim's behavior, telling friends and family that she feared for her safety. Most chilling of all was a text message Becky sent to her sister more than a year before her death. "If something ever happens to me, please make sure the number 1 person of interest is Tim." It was a message that would prove prophetic in the most tragic way possible. As their divorce dragged on, Becky's fears seemed to intensify. She told friends about hearing voices in her backyard and motion detectors going off at odd hours. Her next-door neighbors had installed a security camera after some car break-ins, and what that camera captured in the weeks leading up to Becky's murder would become crucial evidence. The footage showed a shadowy figure walking down the driveway that ran alongside Becky's house. Not once, but multiple times. Always in the middle of the night. Always when Becky would be home alone with her children sleeping upstairs. Someone was watching her. Someone was learning her routines, her vulnerabilities, her schedule. Someone was planning the night of February 22nd into the early morning hours of February 23rd. 2023, that plan was put into action. While most of Quincy slept peacefully, a killer made their way through the darkness toward Becky's home. They brought with them a crowbar to pry open windows, gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, and most importantly, a loaded 9mm handgun. What happened next was captured not by video cameras, but by the cold, hard evidence left behind at the scene. The killer had climbed onto Becky's roof using a patio chair, then moved past several easier entry points to reach a second-story window in one of her children's bedrooms. They pried it open and climbed inside. Becky was in her bedroom when she heard the intrusion. In a moment of pure terror, she managed to dial 911 on her cell phone, but before she could speak to an operator, The phone was knocked from her hands. She ran toward her bathroom, perhaps hoping to lock herself inside, but her attacker was right behind her. The killer fired 14 shots. 14 deliberate, calculated shots that ensured Becky would never leave that bathroom alive. But here's what makes this crime even more chilling. None of those wounds were immediately fatal. Becky lay dying on that cold bathroom floor for minutes, alone and in agony, while her killer calmly walked away. When Becky's father discovered her body hours later, he found a scene that would haunt the investigators for months to come. Shell casings scattered across the floor, pieces of plastic that would later be identified as fragments from grocery store bags. And most telling of all, a partial shoe print that suggested this was no random crime. This was personal. This was planned. And this was about to become one of the most shocking murder cases in Illinois history. The investigation that followed would uncover a web of surveillance videos, DNA evidence, and digital footprints that painted a disturbing picture of obsession and control. It would reveal internet searches for homemade silencers and techniques for cleaning gunpowder off hands. It would expose a fake social media account used to track down information about Becky's new romantic relationships. And at the center of it all would be Tim Bleefnick, the man who had once joked about regretting his marriage on national television, now facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars for allegedly ending that marriage in the most violent way imaginable. But Tim maintained his innocence. He had an alibi. He claimed he was home with their 3 children that night, being the devoted father he had always been. The evidence against him was circumstantial. His lawyers argued coincidental, the product of investigators who had rushed to judgment and targeted the most obvious suspect. The question that would consume the small town of Quincy for months was simple, yet profound. Was Tim Bleefnick a grieving ex-husband wrongly accused of a horrific crime? Or was he a calculating killer who had planned the perfect murder? The truth about what happened that night would have to be pieced together from fragments of evidence, digital breadcrumbs, and the testimony of those who knew Tim and Becky best. And as investigators dug deeper into the case, they discovered that the warning signs had been there all along. Becky's sister Sarah had never trusted Tim completely, but even she was shocked by the brutality of what had happened. When the call came that February morning, she knew immediately who was responsible. It wasn't intuition or guesswork. It was the culmination of months of watching her sister live in fear, of hearing about strange incidents and threatening behavior that had escalated as their divorce proceedings dragged on. The surveillance footage from the neighbor's security camera became a crucial piece of the puzzle. Those grainy images of someone walking down the driveway in the dead of night weren't random occurrences. They were reconnaissance missions. Someone was studying Becky's routine, learning when she was most vulnerable, planning the perfect moment to strike. But who was that shadowy figure? The video quality was too poor to make out a face or even determine if it was a man or woman. What investigators could see was someone on a bicycle, riding through the neighborhood at hours when no normal person would be out in the cold Illinois winter. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Every time that figure appeared on camera, it corresponded with other suspicious activity in the area. When police began canvassing the neighborhood for more evidence, they found that bicycle less than half a block from Tim's house. It was a blue Schwinn with no reflectors on the wheels, matching exactly what had been captured on the security footage. But Tim insisted it wasn't his bike, that he'd never seen it before, that its proximity to his home was just another unfortunate coincidence in a case built on circumstantial evidence. His defense team would argue that point repeatedly during the trial. Yes, Tim and Becky had been going through a bitter divorce. Yes, he had made some questionable internet searches. Yes, there were shell casings in his home that matched the murder weapon, but none of that proved he was a killer. It just proved he was a man going through the most difficult period of his life. The prosecution saw things very differently. They believed they were looking at a carefully orchestrated murder carried out by someone who knew Becky's habits intimately. The killer had bypassed multiple easier entry points to climb through a second-story window in a child's bedroom. They knew that particular room would be empty that night because Tim had the children staying with him. Even more damning was the timing. Becky was murdered just 1 week before their divorce case was scheduled to go to trial. Court documents revealed that Becky had been preparing to present testimony about Tim's father that could have been devastating to the family's reputation. She wanted supervised visitation only, citing concerns about the children's safety and well-being. For a man who prosecutors described as obsessed with control and public image, the thought of those allegations becoming public might have been unbearable. They painted a picture of Tim as someone who would rather see Becky dead than allow her to expose family secrets or win custody of their children. The digital evidence told its own story. Tim's phone revealed hundreds of searches related to his ex-wife's new romantic relationship. On Valentine's Day, just a week before the murder, someone had been spotted on the neighbor's security camera while Becky's new boyfriend's truck was parked in her driveway. Within minutes of that sighting, Tim's phone showed extensive searches for that man's license plate number and vehicle identification number. It was the behavior of someone consumed by jealousy and rage. Prosecutors argued, someone who couldn't accept that Becky had moved on with her life while he remained trapped in the past. The murder weapon itself provided perhaps the most compelling evidence. Police found spent shell casings in Tim's home that forensic experts determined had been fired from the same gun used to kill Becky. It was a 9mm handgun that Becky had once given Tim as a gift. Back when their marriage was happy and they still trusted each other completely, when their relationship soured and Becky filed for protection orders, she had specifically requested that Tim return that gun. Court records showed she wanted it back because it was registered in her name, but Tim claimed he no longer had it, that he hadn't seen it in years. According to prosecutors, he was lying. They believed he had kept that gun specifically to use against her when the moment was right. The plastic fragments found at the crime scene told another part of the story. Forensic analysis revealed they came from grocery store bags, the kind every household accumulates over time. But these weren't just random pieces of plastic. They appeared to have been used deliberately, possibly to muffle the sound of gunshots or catch shell casings as they were ejected from the weapon. DNA evidence found on those plastic fragments couldn't definitively prove Tim's guilt, but it couldn't exclude him either. The same was true for genetic material found under Becky's fingernails. She had fought for her life in those final moments, scratching and clawing at her attacker, potentially leaving crucial evidence behind. Tim's defense team, led by attorney Casey Schnook, attacked every piece of evidence methodically. The DNA was inconclusive. The shell casings could have been planted. The internet searches were taken out of context. The bicycle could have belonged to anyone. They painted their client as a devoted father who would never orphan his own children by murdering their mother. But the prosecution had one more card to play. They revealed that on the morning of Becky's murder, hours before her body was discovered, Tim had delivered a children's basketball hoop to his father's house. It was a seemingly innocent gesture that took on sinister implications when viewed through the lens of what they knew about the case. Why would a grieving husband be running errands and making deliveries on the same day his ex-wife lay dead in her bathroom? Unless, of course, he already knew she was never going to be a problem again. The trial that followed would captivate the small town of Quincy and draw national attention. Here was a case that had everything: a brutal murder, a bitter divorce, family secrets, and that haunting game show appearance that seemed to predict the tragedy to come. Tim Bleefnick sat in the defendant's chair, maintaining his innocence even as witness after witness testified about his controlling behavior, his obsessive monitoring of Becky's activities, and his desperate attempts to maintain power over a woman who was finally ready to break free. The jury would have to decide whether they were looking at a cold-blooded killer who had planned the perfect murder, or an innocent man caught in a web of circumstantial evidence and coincidence. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the outcome would determine whether Tim spent the rest of his life behind bars or walked free to raise the 3 children who had already lost their mother. When the verdict was read on that May afternoon in 2023, the courtroom fell silent, except for the sound of breathing. Guilty of first-degree murder. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, which in many ways they were. Tim Bleefnick showed no emotion as the judge's gavel came down. His family members in the gallery began to weep. Becky's family finally exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Justice, they said, had been served. But justice couldn't bring back a mother of 3 who had died alone on a bathroom floor. The sentencing hearing 3 months later would be even more emotional. Becky's sister Sarah stood at the podium and delivered words that cut through the formal atmosphere of the courtroom like a blade. She spoke directly to Tim, the man she had once considered family, the father of her nephews, the person she now believed had destroyed their lives forever. Your children's future will be forever impacted by your crime, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. They are already suffering. Maybe you should have Googled childhood PTSD between your internet searches for homemade silencers and VIN numbers. It was a devastating moment that captured the true cost of this tragedy. 3 young boys had lost their mother to violence and their father to prison. They would grow up knowing that the 2 people who were supposed to protect them above all else had instead become locked in a battle that ended with one dead and the other condemned to die behind bars. Judge Robert Adrian had the option of sentencing Tim to anywhere between 45 years and life without parole. He chose the harshest penalty available, telling Tim that he had researched the murder, planned it, and executed it with a coldness that demanded the ultimate punishment. You broke into her house and you shot her 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 times, the judge said, his voice rising with each number. The court believes that the appropriate sentence would be natural life in prison. Life without the possibility of parole. Tim Bleefnick would never see freedom again. He would never attend another of his children's baseball games or school plays. He would never walk them down the aisle at their weddings or hold his grandchildren. The man who had once stood on a game show stage and joked about regretting his marriage would spend the rest of his days in a concrete cell, paying for what the jury believed was the ultimate expression of that regret. But even as Tim was led away in shackles, questions remained. His defense team immediately announced plans to appeal, maintaining that their client had been convicted on circumstantial evidence and speculation rather than concrete proof. They argued that the real killer was still out there, that justice had not been served but perverted. The prosecutors disagreed. They believed they had followed the evidence exactly where it led them, building a case piece by piece until the truth became undeniable. The shell casings, the DNA fragments, the surveillance footage, the internet searches, the timing of the murder, all of it pointed to one inescapable conclusion. For the community of Quincy, the trial's end brought a mixture of relief and sadness. The streets were safe again, but the cost had been enormous. A beloved nurse was gone forever. 3 children were orphaned. A family was shattered beyond repair, and the illusion of safety that small towns cherish had been stripped away by the recognition that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. The case would be remembered not just for its brutality, but for the way it revealed how domestic violence can escalate in shadows, how warning signs can be missed or dismissed, and how the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones who pose the greatest danger. Becky's final text message to her sister, the one predicting that if something happened to her, Tim should be the first suspect, became a haunting reminder that victims of domestic abuse often know their fate long before anyone else recognizes the danger. She had tried to protect herself through the legal system, through restraining orders and custody battles, but in the end, the system had failed her when she needed it most. Today, Tim Bleefnick sits in an Illinois maximum security prison, maintaining his innocence and fighting his conviction through the appeals process. His children are being raised by Becky's parents, trying to build new lives from the wreckage of unimaginable tragedy. And somewhere in a television archive, that Family Feud episode still exists. A bizarre time capsule of a moment when a joke about marriage regret seemed harmless and funny, rather than prophetic and chilling. It serves as a reminder that we never really know the people around us as well as we think we do, and that sometimes the most ordinary moments can take on extraordinary significance when viewed through the lens of tragedy. The game show and the murder. 2 seemingly unconnected events that became forever linked in one of the most shocking criminal cases in recent memory. A reminder that truth, as they say, can indeed be stranger than fiction.